Good morning. The 9013th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. Give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
в связи с утверждением повестки дня сегодняшнего заседания, которое звучит как «Поддержание мира и безопасности на Украине», хотели бы сделать следующее заявление. Как мы вас уже информировали в рабочем порядке, мы не возражаем против добавления в повестку дня работы Совета Безопасности данного пункта. Видим, что его авторы вкладывают в него самые различные смыслы, включая проблематику женщин, детей и образования. Делаем вывод, что он охватывает самые различные аспекты ситуации на Украине и, по сути, универсален. В этой связи полагаем целесообразным удаление из повестки дня Совета Безопасности двух других пунктов, касающихся Украины, а именно писем России и Украины от 2014 года. Это отвечает здравому смыслу и отражает текущую ситуацию. С учетом вышесказанного призываем действующего председателя Совета предпринять необходимые процедурные действия с тем, чтобы оформить введение нового и удаление старых пунктов. Ожидаем, что это будет заблаговременно, в том числе с тем, чтобы у будущих председателей Совета Безопасности не возникло проблем с согласованием программы работы Совета в предстоящие месяцы. Благодарю вас.
I thank the Russian Federation for their statement. Would any other council member like to speak on this point? Yes. I give the... I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you very much. So, colleagues, as we have made clear to council members, including to the Russian Federation, the meeting under today's agenda item was proposed without prejudice to the agenda items regarding the 2014 letter, specifically the 2014 letter from the Ukrainian permanent representative and the 2014 letter from the Russian permanent representative. While the scope of the situation in Ukraine has grown far beyond the circumstances in 2014, it is important to recognize its history, and it is possible that member states will wish to focus on Crimea during future meetings. Accordingly, the earlier agenda items must remain in place. Against this backdrop, I ask that we continue with the meeting and that the agenda be adopted.
I thank the representative of the United States, the representative of the Russian Federation.
Мне кажется, нас неправильно поняли. Мы не против того, чтобы заседание продолжалось по озвученному вами пункту повестки дня «Поддержание мира и безопасности на Украине». Поэтому повестка дня уже утверждена, мы можем продолжать. Мы свои замечания высказали, надеемся, они будут учтены.
Are there any further comments on this item? The United States? No. Colleagues, it is my understanding that both the Ukraine and Russia letters from 2014 are on the list of items of which the Council is currently seized. I understand that the process for removing items is normally governed by Note 507 and usually takes 3 years. But if there are no other views on this matter, given the split views that we have heard, I propose that we discuss this issue separately and seek to agree a way forward in the coming days. I thank you. So, in accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Sima Bauhaus, the Executive Director of UN Women, Mr. Manuel Fontaine, the Director of Emergencies at Unicef, and Ms. Katerina Cherepaka, President of La Strada, Ukraine. It is so decided. Ms. Cherepaka is joining today's meeting via video teleconference. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I now give the floor to Ms. Sima Bauhaus.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and Ambassador Hoxha, for calling this meeting, and thank you to Ambassador Woodward for hosting this briefing during your presidency of the United Kingdom. At the outset, I want to express my solidarity with all Ukrainians, women and girls, men and boys, those who have left for safety and those who have stayed. My heart goes out to all families who have lost a loved one. This war must stop, and it must stop now. I returned last night to New York from Moldova, where the consequences of the senseless war in Ukraine were stark. Moldova has rightly been described as a small country with a big heart. Despite still reeling from COVID-19 pandemic, and with determination to achieve their national development priorities, they opened their borders and homes for those fleeing shelling and guns in Ukraine, the majority of whom are women, children, and the elderly. An estimated 95,000 Ukrainians are hosted in-country to date. Thousands and thousands more transited since the war started. At the different temporary shelters I visited in Moldova, exhausted, anxious, fearful, tearful mothers shared their worries about the future of their country, about the future of their daughters and sons and their families. A young girl from Odessa, Tatiana, told me her city is beautiful. She has a dream to become a doctor, and had her studies abruptly interrupted by the necessity to flee. In an act of determination and resilience, she and her colleagues are continuing their schooling online with the help of their teachers as well. Tatiana is determined to not let this war disrupt her dream. Vitali, a young boy of maybe 7, told me about his sleepless nights, worried about his father, who was left behind to patrol the streets in their hometown. I witnessed buses full of women and children arrive at the Palanca border, tired, weary, and fearful. There, they were met with dignity, with compassion, and volunteers from civil society organizations, many of whom we support as UN Women. I heard from women's civil society organizations how they adapted their work overnight, going from grappling with 2 emergencies, COVID-19 and the energy crisis, to a third. They were able to work with the government to ensure that basic needs were met and services provided. They do this without specific humanitarian response training. UN Women, at their request, is supporting them in this adjustment. And UN Women is acting on our coordination mandate, working with the refugee response team and civil society partners to ensure that the gendered nature of this crisis is addressed with a gender-sensitive response. This includes services to provide with a focus on protection and to address the increased trauma and psychosocial support needs that I saw so starkly. Young women who left their homes at night, families who are separated, the constant fear of the future. This trauma risks destroying a generation. We must continue our support, but most importantly, we must continue all efforts to advance peace. I condemn in the strongest possible way the recent attack on Kramatorsk train station, which also killed civilians and UN civil society partners. The people killed in the train station are like the people met at the border, women and children and the elderly looking for safety. Humanitarians are not a target. Civilians are not a target. Excellencies, we are increasingly hearing of rape and sexual violence. These allegations must be independently investigated to ensure justice and accountability. The combination of mass displacement with the large presence of conscripts and mercenaries and the brutality displayed against Ukrainian civilians has raised all red flags. This esteemed body will hear more on this from the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict on Wednesday. Excellencies, a war of this magnitude impacts the world far beyond the borders of Ukraine. I also heard from the government in Moldova and the border police a need for increased support to monitor border crossings. The risk of human trafficking is increasing as the situation becomes more desperate. Young women and unaccompanied teenagers are at a particular risk. I call on all countries to increase their efforts in combating trafficking and commend all the host countries for their collaboration on that and on prevention. I equally call on all countries to support Moldova and others with increased resources for the police forces so that they can ensure support to victims of gender-based violence and trafficking. Gender-sensitive and survivor-centered response must be at the heart of all humanitarian action. Excellencies, through all these horrors, women continue to serve and lead their communities and support the internally displaced in Ukraine. Women make up 80% of all health and social care workers in Ukraine, and many of them chose not to evacuate. We have seen the women members of parliament continue to fulfill their duties in the Verkhovna Rada while bombs fell around Kiev. And we have also seen the Deputy Prime Minister engage in the humanitarian response. I have seen Ukrainian women, refugees in Moldova also working in the shelters and taking on roles to support each other. Women's organizations within Ukraine have not stopped working, adjusting their work to meet the immediate needs of the populations they serve. They do this at great risk to their own lives. They were there before the war, they remain there during, and they will be there to pick up the pieces after. I salute their courage and their steadfastness. They need our continued support. The Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund is already supporting several women's organizations on the front line in Ukraine and in Moldova to aid displaced women and girls, including shelter, medication, food, psychosocial support, including to women and girls living with disabilities or HIV or AIDS. The fund is also providing institutional support to these organizations to sustain them. With your help, we can do much more. Excellencies, without fail, every Ukrainian man, woman, and child I met had one dream: to be able to return homes. However, I heard yesterday many do not have homes to go back to. I call on this Council to continue to use all avenues for peace. From UN Women's own rapid gender analysis, we know that women are asking to be part of the solution. I heard from women in the shelters that they too are taking on leadership roles and supporting the refugee responses in the host countries, and many of them are in touch with other women, their friends, their family, who are supporting the IDPs within Ukraine. We know from experience that women's participation makes response and recovery more effective and more sustainable. And women's organizations are uniquely qualified to help not just women, but other marginalized and vulnerable groups. It is vital that they are consulted and engaged in all decisions related to the crisis response and related to peace. They need not be seen as victims only, but as agents and leaders of change, which they are. This Security Council has adopted 10 resolutions calling for women to be meaningfully involved in any decision or negotiation about peace and security. And we know that women's involvement is both a right and an opportunity for better outcomes. This is especially important in a war that has so starkly illustrated gender-based differences. Let us not lose sight of this. I have seen firsthand the impact of women's leadership can have. Yet women are largely absent from any current negotiation efforts. We ask the Security Council, all member states, and our development and humanitarian partners to ensure the meaningful participation of women and girls, including from marginalized groups, in all decision-making processes, peace, diplomacy, and humanitarian. Without this, we will not have peace, development, nor human security. To conclude, we strongly echo the Secretary General's repeated calls for peace, an immediate cessation of hostilities, and the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territories. Tatiana, the young girl from the shelter in Moldova, must be supported and enabled to pursue her medical degree and to be a part of the future of her country. The war must stop, and it must stop now. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Behus, for the briefing, and good morning. From me, I now give the floor to Mr. Emmanuel Fontaine.
Mr. President, Excellencies and colleagues, first I would like to express my appreciation to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and to Ambassador Ferit Hoxha for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Ambassador Woodward and the United Kingdom for hosting this briefing during your Security Council presidency. I actually just returned from a mission to Ukraine, and I must say in my 31 years as a humanitarian, I've rarely seen so much damage caused in so little time. Friday's attack on Kramatorsk train station was particularly horrifying. The station has been a critical route for thousands of families fleeing Donetsk Oblast, an area that has seen some of the war's worst violence and destruction. When the station was attacked, it was filled with families desperate to escape the mounting violence. I note the tragic irony that our teams were actually offloading life-saving humanitarian supplies only a kilometer away when so many lives were taken away by this needless act of violence. The attack on Kramatorsk station is unconscionable, and yet it is just one of many instances in this war where we have seen a blatant disregard for civilian lives and international humanitarian law. Inside Ukraine, children and families and communities are under attack. Of the 3.2 million children estimated to have remained in their homes, nearly half may be at risk of not having enough food. Attacks on water system infrastructure and power outages have left an estimated 1.4 million people without access to water in Ukraine. Another 4.6 million people have only limited access. The situation is even worse in cities like Mariupol and Kherson, where children and their families have now gone weeks without running water and sanitation services, a regular supply of food and medical care. They are sheltering in their homes and underground, waiting for the bombs and violence to stop. As of yesterday, the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office has verified 142 children killed and 229 children injured. We know these numbers are likely much higher, and many of them were caused by crossfire or the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I actually met one of those children in an intensive care unit in the hospital ward of Zaporizhia. Vlad, who is a 4-year-old, was shot twice in the stomach as he was escaping with his family from a contested area. Although still unconscious, Vlad is expected to live, unlike so many others. All the systems that help children survive are also under attack. Hostilities have damaged or destroyed hundreds of residential houses. Attacks on hospital, healthcare facilities, and medical equipment, and the killing and injuring of healthcare professionals are making it even harder for people to access emergency care, basic healthcare, and medicine. Hundreds of schools and educational facilities have been attacked or used for military purposes. Others are serving as shelters for civilians. Nationwide school closures are impacting the learning and the future of 5.7 million school-aged children and 1.5 million students in higher education. In the Donbass region, a whole generation of children have already seen their lives and education upended during the past 8 years of conflict. We applaud the effort of the authorities to ensure continuity of education. However, this can only be a temporary solution. Lessons from the pandemic show that the importance of children learning in a school with their peers and teachers. Excellencies, I met families in Zaporizhia who told me that they wanted to stay in their homes, but were forced to flee when the shelling and violence became too much. Thousands of others now are trying to leave before the fighting closes in around them. They face further dangers along the way, missiles, crossfire, and explosive remnants. In just 6 weeks, nearly two-thirds of all Ukrainian children have been displaced. They have been forced to leave behind everything, their homes, their school, and often their family members. I have heard stories of the desperate steps parents are taking to get their children to safety, and children being saddened that they are unable to get back to school. A social worker told me a story about parents who were forced to send their children with a truck driver just to get them away from the line of fire. Such unaccompanied children, of course, are at much higher risk of violence, abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. Women face a particular risk. We are extremely concerned by increasing reports of sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. Fortunately, there has been an outpouring of support from neighboring countries to welcome refugees. The solidarity expressed for Ukrainian refugees has been a very welcome development, one that surely should be replicated globally for all seeking protection and asylum, no matter where they come from. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are doing everything we can. Inside Ukraine, we continue to face extremely difficult operating conditions. We have seen some progress in recent weeks with our teams and supplies able to reach Sumy, Kharkiv, and Kramatorsk, among others. But this is not enough. Ongoing hostilities prevent us from reaching those most in need in many areas of the country. We saw that last week in Kramatorsk, when our teams were actually forced to stop offloading supplies and had to evacuate to safety following the nearby explosions. We are also helping local authorities to identify and register unaccompanied and separated children. We are providing families with much-needed humanitarian cash assistance and increasing awareness to minimize the risk of explosive ordnance. In Zaporizhia, I visited a reception center set up by local authorities, run mostly by women professionals, for displaced people to access health and psychosocial services, have a warm meal, and rest temporarily. These services are critical, but they are not the solution. Many of those who were able to flee early have been able to find sanctuary in other countries. It is not clear how those who are being displaced now will actually fare. They have been exposed to violence for longer and may have less resources at their disposal. Resources are already overstretched, and local residents live in a state of uncertainty as the sound of air raids and warnings from local officials ring regularly, reminding them that the front lines may soon reach them too. Excellencies, I'm particularly concerned about the widespread presence of explosive remnants of war, which expose children to the risk of death and horrendous injury. Eastern Ukraine was already one of the world's most mine-contaminated stretches of land, even prior to the recent escalation. This reality is rapidly extending to other parts of the country. We are also carefully monitoring the health, rights, and dignity of women and girls as the risk of exploitation and abuse grows. And we continue to reiterate the need to ensure that children who have become separated from their families and who live in institutional care are protected, and that every effort be made to obtain caregiver consent and authorities' approval before these children are evacuated or relocated. In closing, I want to express how proud I am of our UN teams both inside Ukraine and in neighboring countries. The work they are doing is indispensable. I want to also salute the remarkable resilience of Ukrainian doctors, nurses, teachers, and social workers, especially women who have been at the forefront of the response. I was personally deeply impressed by the care they are providing children and families. I visited an underground maternity ward in Lviv that is staffed 24/7 by a team of tireless women assisting birth amidst air raid alerts. Local women's organizations are mobilizing grassroots networks to care for the most vulnerable, even on the darkest of circumstances. Their courage and commitment are a light in the dark. But most of all, I want to entreat all those with the power to end this war to actually use that power. The lives and future of millions of children hang in the balance. Excellencies, the math is simple. Every day the war continues, children will continue to suffer. As humanitarians, you can count on us to continue doing our work. But there's only so much we can do. It is time to end this war. Ukraine's children cannot afford to wait. Thank you.
Mr. Fontaine, thank you very much. I now give the floor to Ms. Katerina Charapaka, who joins us on the video link. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, today I have an honor and responsibility to speak and testify as a part of civil society organizations who stand for protection of independence and freedom of Ukraine for invasion by Russia. Organizations who consolidate their efforts at the national, regional, and community level with state and individuals, men and women, adults and children, who provide assistance, who help to save lives of civilians, often most vulnerable ones, who collect evidences and testimonies of survivors of war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine, to document them and to help to bring justice. I speak as a women's rights activist, as a specialist, as a mother, and since February 24, as a displaced person. With a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the whole population of the country is under the life threat. Women and children, as it always happened in the wartime, are the most vulnerable ones. In my presentation, I would like to focus on 4 aspects related to the impact of Russian aggression on women and children. Women and children are the biggest part of internally displaced people and refugees who left the country trying to save their lives. Often, they become invulnerable to the risk of gender-based violence, exploitation, and trafficking. Very often, during evacuation, with clearly indicated signs of being civilian, unarmed, carrying children, they are brutally killed by Russian troops. Hitting railway station in Kramatorsk, where civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, were waiting for evacuation train. The city where our colleagues, women's rights activists, put so many efforts to promote 1325 resolution and its spirit. Hitting maternity and child hospitals, kindergartens. Bombing theater building in Mariupol, where women, children were sheltering, and with the clear signs, children that were visible from the sky. The city that always connected us with sisters and colleagues from Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. We received calls from women in Mariupol informing about forced deportation of civilians, including unaccompanied children, by Russian troops to Donetsk and further to Russia. So-called evacuation. Women were deported under the threat of rape and killing. Women in local administration, self-government bodies, they are also exposed to threat of kidnapping, torture, and killing. The head of Matizhin village, Kievska Oblast, Olga Sukhenka, was found dead together with her husband and son after being taken by Russian troops who occupied the village, severely tortured and killed, for staying with her community and performing her duty, organizing support, medicine, food to people. The deputy of Zaporozhye Oblast administration, Leila Ibragimova, was kidnapped from her home. Director of the kindergarten, In Kyievska Oblast, Larisa Osipenko, killed by occupants because of her profession. You should not rise Nazis, they said. This tragic list of crime committed by thousands of ordinary Russian soldiers claiming that they didn't know where they are can be continued. Women are the important actors of peace and security sector in Ukraine, and their contribution during the war is really incredible. Together with activists, volunteers, journalists, they also become the target of the occupants. Ukrainian volunteer Yulia Payevska, Taira, many years for saving lives of people in the occupied by Russian territories on the east of Ukraine, captured by Russian troops while organizing assistance for civilians in Mariupol. A video with captured Taira was shown where she was forced to call to find the solution of the situation. At this moment, there is no information about her condition and what the situation is now with her. Women prisoners of war, exposed to torture, including sexual violence, undressed in front of the male groups, harassed, shaved. Journalists, female journalists kidnapped in Zaporozhska Oblast, 2 journalists, and another one killed near the Kyiv while performing their professional duties. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and rape during the wartime. A number of facts and cases already revealed and reported, but unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg that we'll see. Many survivors remain in the situation of life threat. They are staying on the occupied territory. They are cut off from help, connection, from everything. We receive such calls to the national hotlines operated by La Strada Ukraine. For today, we have 9 cases of rape by Russian soldiers in the temporary occupied towns and villages. About 12 women and girls, children. Reports from Kievska, Khersonska, and Chernigivska Oblast, reported by the survivors themselves and by the witnesses. Raped by a group of occupants multiple times, with life threat to survivors, their children, their family members, in front of the family members and other people. Real cases, real people, real facts. We see extreme traumatization, fear for life, not readiness to talk about what had happened. Those who manage to escape somehow to safer place are too traumatized to report. They need support, therapy, recovery first. We know that many of these cases will hardly or even never be disclosed, unfortunately, as many of those suffered are killed already by Russian invaders. We know and see, and we want you to hear our voices, that violence and rape is used now as a weapon of war by Russian invaders in Ukraine. At the same time, the war also shows the important role that women play in standing for Ukraine, in the processes of restoring the peace, strengthening and developing on the country and democracy process. We do not want you to look at us only as victims of Russian military aggression. Women in peace and security sector, volunteers, activists, journalists, human rights defenders are an integral part of the progress and development in Ukraine. We have knowledge, we have skills, we have expertise, we have strength, but we need to be saved and protected now. We call to all members of the Security Council, international institutions, the governments, to stop the war and demonstrate your solidarity in the concrete and practical actions, to find and to use the tools to stop Russian aggression and to ensure that your decisions are not blocked and not ignored. We call to ensure security of children, women, and men of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Katerina Charapaka for her briefing and thank her for joining us today. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And with that, I begin with Her Excellency, the Ambassador of the United States. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. President. We're honored by your presence here with us today and thankful to the United Kingdom for leading this debate. Thank you to our briefers from UN Women and UNICEF for your remarks and for the work your teams are doing on the ground. I, too, visited Romania and Moldova and saw your teams on the ground working with vulnerable people. And I'd like to give an especially strong thank you to Ms. Charapaka for being with us today and for sharing the voices of women and children in Ukraine. She's the first civil society briefer we've had brief us in an official council meeting. Thank you very much. When men like President Putin start wars, women and children get displaced. Women and children get hurt. Women and children get raped and abused, and women and children die. Since the start of Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, Russia has bombed orphanages and maternity hospitals. We've seen mass graves with dead children stacked on top of each other. On Friday, a train station being used for civilian evacuations, mostly women and children, was struck by a Russian missile. Washington Post reporters saw at least 20 dead, including children. Limbs and luggage were scattered everywhere. A maimed dog shivered next to one of the dead. According to the reporters, a large piece of missile on the scene had chilling words written on the side. In Russian, it said, "For the children." That is what Russia's war looks like. What is happening to women and children in Ukraine is horrific, beyond comprehension. Mr. President, when I was in Moldova and Romania, I saw with my own eyes some of the human toll of Russia's brutal war. I met with a few of the 11.6 million people who are now displaced from their homes, representatives of the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The mass displacement includes over half of all of Ukraine's children. Half of Ukraine's children have left behind their homes, their schools, and often at least one of their parents. Meanwhile, 90% of refugees from Ukraine are women and children. And as our briefers make clear today, being a woman or a child adds an additional risk. Women in Ukraine are at increased risk for gender-based violence, including rape, sexual assault, and sexual exploitation. We know that anyone at risk before war is at a heightened risk of being targeted for physical and sexual violence during a war, and that includes women and children, religious and ethnic minorities, LGBTQI+ individuals, and people living with disabilities. The deputy mayor of Ivankiv told reporters that some girls are cutting their hair short in hopes of avoiding rape by Russian troops. Family separations leave girls in particular at increased risk for sexual exploitation and trafficking, and we've heard sobering reports of traffickers targeting women as they seek protection abroad. All of this is why the United States initiative, Safe from the Start, calls on all humanitarian actors to prioritize resources and programs to address gender-based violence from the onset. Given everything we know about gender-based violence in conflict and the accounts we're hearing, we cannot wait for a lengthy assessment. We should not hold up resources with the excuse of incomplete data. This is an active crisis that grows worse by the day. We need to start interventions immediately to prevent and respond to gender-based violence now. For our part, the United States funded humanitarian efforts in and around Ukraine lift up networks for survivors of gender-based violence in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, and we're supporting programs for child protection and advocacy too. We will continue to support our partners in these efforts. For example, we're highly supportive of UNICEF's mobile child protection teams, and we're working in conflict zones like Ukraine to deliver life-saving supplies and provide emergency social work services. These horrific acts also remind us that we must support efforts to prevent them from happening in the first place. This means ensuring that women's voices and rights are always respected and elevated. And it means ensuring that abuses against them and against children are held to account. There must be pathways to healing and access to justice for survivors. Finally, I want to remind us all that women are far from passive victims in this war. As we just heard from UN Women, women are playing critical leadership roles in Ukraine to address this impact of the war. Some women are valiantly defending their homes, their communities, their country, including many women who've been serving in the Ukrainian military since 2014. Others are protecting their families and their children, bringing them to safety. And still others are the ones supplying food and shelter, water and medicine to those in need. Women are the ones who will get Ukraine through this humanitarian catastrophe, and women must be consistently and meaningfully involved as active participants and leaders in securing long-term sustainable peace. When I met with women in Moldova and Romania, they all had different stories, but they all had the same dream: to return to a peaceful Ukraine, to return to a Ukraine where they have a say in their own and their children's future. Let us ensure women are a robust part of that peace process, and let us hope that day they dreamed of comes soon. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President, Lord Ahmad, for chairing this meeting, a testimony of its importance and timeliness. Dear colleagues, the Russian aggression has not stopped. It continues to cause undue pain and suffering to 44 million people who did not ask for it. The relentless brutality and the destructive force of actions of the Russian army against civilians and vital civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is catastrophic. Unspeakable crimes have been committed, and each day the various pieces of the horror puzzle are falling in place. Grisly images of bodies charred or run over by tanks, mass graves, torture chambers, interceptions confirming that Ukrainian prisoners of war had been shot dead after being interrogated by Russian soldiers, playgrounds cribbled with bullet holes, kids' shoes scattered among the rubble of a school in ruins. Everyone is suffering in Ukraine, but the situation is particularly devastating for women and for children. This is why we called for this meeting, and what we heard from the briefers, whom I thank, is appalling. We're very pleased to listen to Ms. Cherepaka, and all accounts coincide. We just don't know yet all the horrible details. Hundreds of thousands of women have been forced to flee their homes. Others are fighting bravely to protect their country or work under bombardment and indiscriminate shelling as doctors, nurses, and other professionals providing essential service to their communities. We express our gratitude to all countries for their big heart in helping Ukrainians fleeing the war. Women and girls face heightened risks of gender-based violence, human trafficking, exploitation, and conflict-related sexual violence due to displacement. Their needs must be a priority in the humanitarian response. But the situation of children is even worse. As we heard from Mr. Fontaine, since the start of the war, 2/3 of the total child population of Ukraine have been forced out of their homes. Those still inside the country remain trapped in what has become a national nightmare. And if all this were not enough, some 120,000 Ukrainian children have reportedly been forcibly deported to Russia. Save the Children reports that since the start of the war, an average of 22 schools have come under attack every single day in Ukraine. Last October, this council adopted Resolution 2601, which urges all parties to cease attacks and threats of attacks against schools. It was us. Destroying on purpose the educational infrastructure and making it dysfunctional for the years to come is simply criminal. Schools should be safe places, free from any kind of violence. And learning during conflict and crisis must be maintained, as it helps maintain a sense of normalcy and foster resilience. We know that mass displacement and refugee flows always create conditions that could lead to human trafficking and an acute child protection crisis. We commend UNICEF for the good work in providing recreational activities and psychological support in Ukraine. Blue Dot centers are offering crucial services of counsel and protection. Mr. President, some 150 children will never see the end of war in Ukraine. They have been killed. Hundreds more, injured, will bear the marks of this war forever on their body. Children's lives are always shaped by the behavior of adults who themselves struggle in times of war. They have the duty to provide care and protection and ensure their upbringing. But how can a frightened mother holding her child avoid passing on her worst nightmare and fear that all of a sudden the kid may end up alone? How to explain war to children who in a matter of hours had to leave behind their family environment, friends, pets and toys, and who traumatized are unable to sleep or eat? In their normal life, children draw parents, houses and trees. Russian war has made Ukrainian kids draw bombs, tanks and weapons. Mr. President, civilian massacres carried out by Russian forces have rightfully stirred world outcry. Russia should have learned that a war can't be won through massacres. During the wars in the Balkans in the late 90s, the crimes against innocent civilians in Vukovar, Croatia, Srebrenica in Bosnia, and Racak in Kosovo did not help any of the perpetrators win the war. And this war will be no exception. We hear public indignation on one recurring question: why can't the UN do more to stop Russia? This question is right, and the anger is justified, because Russia with its veto has taken this council hostage, preventing it to deliver security in Ukraine. But thankfully, there is more of the UN that Russia cannot veto. We have met here 15 times in 10 weeks to expose Russia's despicable deeds and show its isolation. Also, in a matter of few weeks, Russia has, in 3 crucial consecutive votes, been put against the wall in the UNGA, which, in a remarkable and historic move, suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council. While deploring the Council's inability for reasons clear to all, we should be proud of the UN for standing firm against aggression, for looking Russia right in the eye and say, you are wrong and you will pay. Under international law, a military commander is responsible for war crimes committed by his troops. Lieutenant Colonel Azatbek Omurbekov, the Russian commander involved in the occupation of Bucha, will have to answer for the atrocities of rape, pillage, and murder of hundreds of Ukrainian civilians for such repugnant disregard of human life. If Kremlin thinks that they will benefit from the Tefal effect, they are wrong. Their crimes stick to their face. 5,600 investigations have been opened so far by Ukraine Prosecutor General. Accountability must be ensured. Dear colleagues, before anyone had the time to grasp its breath from the horrors discovered in Bucha and elsewhere around Kiev, a missile hit a train station where several thousand people were waiting to leave. A missile with a vicious signature for all children was sent to kill indiscriminately, including 5 children. And again, we were told, it's not Russia. Haven't we enough of this ridiculous pattern when Russia commits a crime and attributes it to someone else? Who was behind an attempt to overthrow the legitimate government in Montenegro? Who was behind the MH17 plane tragedy hit by a missile? Who carried out indiscriminate bombardments in Aleppo? Who poisoned the Skripals? Who almost killed Navalny? Who is putting the world upside down by a war of choice? All these crimes lead to Russia. We know now that the Russian army doesn't attack civilians except for the residential areas, the schools, the hospitals, the theaters, the kindergartens, and train stations. And we know also that Ukrainian men, women, girls, and children do not qualify as civilians for Russia. They are just a bargaining tool to achieve one man's cynical goal in assimilation and isolation, to force the hand of Ukraine into unacceptable concessions. Life expectancy in Ukraine is now at Kremlin's will. It may decide whether you stay in one of those shattered cities and you starve, It may decide to kill you with its missiles that hit everything indiscriminately. He may also offer the forced hospitality of a Russian camp. Mr. President, as we speak of children, let me end with this note. Reportedly, President Putin is a father. This is one of those words that do not need a definition. And if I were in the unlikely situation to talk to President Putin, the only question I would ask him would be, would you have accepted that your daughters be in the same situation as the 11-year-old Yuri, Ukrainian, who, forced to leave his home, terrified, tells reporters that, and I quote, "Every time there was a shelling, my heart stopped," end of quote. So stop making hearts stop. Stop shelling and bombardments. Order your soldiers still alive to go home, your home, Russia. As the Pink Floyd blasted last week, hey, hey, rise up. It is time for the Russians to come to their senses and stop and stand against this savagery. Thank you.
I thank Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France, Mr. Ambassador.
Monsieur le Président,
President,
je tiens à remercier Madame Baus, Monsieur Fontaine et Madame Chéré-Paca pour leurs exposés. Ceci confirme la profonde préoccupation que nous avons exprimée depuis le début de l'agression russe. Nous sommes encore sous le choc de l'attaque abominable contre la gare de Kramatorsk vendredi. Celle-ci pourrait constituer un crime contre l'humanité, comme l'a souligné le ministre Le Drian. Les attaques indiscriminées doivent cesser. La France est gravement préoccupée par la multiplication des allégations de violences sexuelles. Les résolutions de ce Conseil sur les violences sexuelles en temps de conflit s'imposent à tous. Nous soutenons ainsi l'action des Nations Unies sur place pour établir les faits et les responsabilités. Ces violences ne sauraient rester impunies. La France appelle par ailleurs au renforcement du soutien apporté aux survivants de violences sexuelles. Nous condamnons à ce titre les destructions d'infrastructures de santé et leurs conséquences sur l'accès à la santé sexuelle et reproductive. Les attaques contre les hôpitaux peuvent également constituer des crimes de guerre. Nous l'avons entendu, la guerre bouleverse aussi la vie des enfants ukrainiens. Les meurtres et mutilations d'enfants resteront des taches indélébiles sur leurs auteurs, tout comme les attaques contre les écoles. Nous appelons le secrétaire général des Nations Unies à se saisir des outils mis en place par ce Conseil pour protéger les enfants contre les graves violations les visant. Par ailleurs, les populations civiles sont particulièrement exposées dans le cadre des déplacements contraints. Nous soutenons l'action des Nations Unies pour prévenir les risques de traite. Monsieur le Président, face à cette agression aux conséquences insupportables sur les femmes et enfants d'Ukraine, la France reste entièrement mobilisée. Nous appelons à une cessation immédiate des hostilités, un retrait total des troupes russes de l'intégralité du territoire ukrainien, comme l'a exigé la Cour internationale de justice, et un plein accès humanitaire. Près de 500 tonnes de matériel humanitaire ont été envoyées par la France. Elle a aussi annoncé une contribution exceptionnelle de 100 millions d'euros pour la réponse humanitaire. Nous avons également déployé en France un dispositif d'accueil et d'accompagnement pour les femmes et enfants ukrainiens. Près de 10 000 enfants ukrainiens arrivés en France ont déjà pu être scolarisés. La lutte contre l'impunité doit être menée avec vigueur. Nous avons déjà annoncé notre appui au travail d'enquête et de documentation mené par la Cour pénale internationale dans le respect de son indépendance. Une contribution exceptionnelle de 500 000 € a également été accordée au fonds dédié. La France continuera à soutenir tout effort d'enquête indépendante sur les violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme en Ukraine. Enfin, la France soutient la mise en œuvre de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et sécurité dans toutes ses dimensions. Nous saluons le courage des femmes ukrainiennes en première ligne de la réponse humanitaire, politique et militaire en défense de leur pays. Nous rappelons qu'il ne pourra y avoir de solution durable au conflit sans la pleine participation des femmes. Monsieur le Président, nous continuerons à soutenir les femmes et enfants ukrainiens aussi longtemps que nécessaire et ne céderons pas dans nos efforts pour le retour à la paix. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I now invite the representative of Ghana, Your Excellency.
I thank you, Mr. President, and welcome your leadership over this meeting of the Council on the important and timely discussion on the impact of the war on women and children in Ukraine. I would like to thank Ms. Sima Bahaus, Executive Director of UN Women, and Mr. Emmanuel Fontaine, the Emergency Operations Director of UNICEF, for their respective briefings on the situation. We are also grateful to Ms. Katerina Sharapaka, President of the civil society group La Strada Ukraine, for the views shared with the Council. Mr. President, the continued situation of instability and insecurity in Ukraine continues to be a matter of deep concern for Ghana. My delegation is particularly alarmed by the situation of women and children, as well as of the aged, arising from the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine. Ghana strongly deplores the reported acts of widespread and what is emerging to be gross violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine. We condemn the attack of 8 April 2022 on the train station in Kramatorsk, which resulted in significant civilian casualties, and commiserate with the bereaved families and the people of Ukraine. We continue to be pained by the horrifying images of war in Ukraine and by the daily images of fright and despair in the eyes of a people who just a few weeks ago lived normal and stable lives. In situations of war, women and children suffer a disproportionate humanitarian impact, and the war in Ukraine has been no different. Ghana is particularly concerned by the situation of the children of Ukraine who are being scarred by the horrifying images of war. Children should never go through such experiences and must accordingly be protected by all parties in accordance with applicable international law. We note the UN's report that around 4.3 million refugees have fled Ukraine into the neighboring countries, with women and children making up 90% of the refugee population. We regret the 142 children who are reported as having been killed, alongside the 229 others injured. We vow the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, these numbers would increase. We therefore call upon the warring parties, especially the aggressor state, to redouble all efforts for peace in the interest of the women and children of Ukraine, including the women in need of assistance who constitute more than 54% of the people in need from the ongoing crisis. Mr. President, the rising food insecurity, lack of access to essential social services in cities like Mariupol, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv have invariably increased the burden of local women responsible for the care of children, the disabled, and elderly family members. The war has severely impacted social cohesion, community security, and the resilience of local communities, especially for women and girls. The destruction caused by the war, particularly with the use of explosive weapons with wide impact area in civilian populated areas and targeted at medical facilities, has created profound health crisis, with women, girls, and children bearing the greatest brunt of such deprivations. Women and young girls face an increased risk of disruption to life-saving sexual and reproductive health services and access to specialized medication and treatment. Ghana unequivocally condemns the reports of trafficking, sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and exploitation. Such atrocities impact negatively on the physical and psychological health of the victims, as well as on their general well-being, both in the short term but also over the longer-term period. We therefore encourage humanitarian agencies to ensure that identified victims are provided with the needed medical and psychosocial care to overcome the trauma of abuse. We underscore the need for accountability for all alleged violations of international humanitarian and criminal laws, and reiterate our call for an immediate, independent, and impartial investigations to establish the facts of these offenses and build the evidence to hold the perpetrators of such atrocities to account. Mr. President, the gender-related challenges of the war necessarily required a prioritization of the needs of the women and children and the implementation of gender-responsive humanitarian assistance. In this regard, women leaders at all levels of society should be included in coordination mechanisms and decision-making processes. In the spirit of Resolution 1325, we urge the parties to consider including women in their negotiating teams as a way of ensuring their meaningful participation in their diplomatic and political processes. It is important that women are not only counted as victims of the war, but as key participators in finding a lasting and durable solution. In closing, we reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to heed the repeated calls of the international community to withdraw all of its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and pursue the path of dialogue and diplomacy. The cessation of all hostilities and maintenance of effective and safe humanitarian corridors remain fundamental to addressing the worsening humanitarian conditions, especially the unbearable impact of the conflict on Ukrainian women, girls, and children. I thank you very much, Mr. President, for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now invite a contribution from the representative of Mexico. The floor is yours.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you,
señor presidente.
Mr. President.
Excelencia, sea usted bienvenido a
Excellency,
este consejo.
welcome to this council.
Agradecemos las presentaciones de la
We're grateful
directora
for the,
ejecutiva de ONU
presentations
Mujeres,
by the Executive Director
Sima
of UN Women,
de
Sima
Manuel
Bajos,
Fontaine,
and by
director de
Manuel Fontaine,
emergencias de Unicef, y de la
Director
señora
of Emergencies of
Caterina
UNICEF, and
Cherepaca,
by Madam Caterina Cherepaca,
cuya visión desde la sociedad civil
whose
nos
perspective
recuerda la
civil
vulnerabilidad,
society reminds
pero
us
también
of
nos
the
recuerda
vulnerability,
la
but also
fortaleza
reminds us of the
de las mujeres
strength of
ucranianas.
Ukrainian women.
Toda la información disponible
All the information
nos confronta con
available,
un panorama francamente desolador.
confronts us with a truly
La realidad es
devastating
que cada
panorama.
día
The
que
reality is
pasa
that every
y en
day
tanto el
that
conflicto
goes
continúa,
by,
las tragedias
and the conflict
aumentan
continues,
y las necesidades
tragedies
humanitarias se multiplican.
increased and
México
humanitarian needs
condena
are also
el
growing.
reciente ataque a la
Mexico
estación
condemns
de
the recent
trenes
attack against
de
the
Kramatorsk,
main train station
en el
of
que perdieron la
Kramatorsk,
vida lamentablemente decenas
unfortunately
de civiles que
dozens of
esperaban ser
civilians lost their
evacuados,
lives who were waiting to be
incluidas
evacuated,
mujeres y
including
niños.
women and
Los
children.
ataques contra la población
Attacks against the
civil
civilian
y la
population
infraestructura civil
and civilian
violan el
infrastructure
derecho internacional
violate
humanitario
international
y pueden
humanitarian law
constituir
and
crímenes de
could
guerra.
constitute
Esta
war
estación de
crimes.
trenes se encuentra a solo 1 kilómetro
Train
de donde
station
Unicef operaba la entrega
is
de
only
ayuda
1
humanitaria,
kilometer
como
from
nos han
the
informado.
spot where
Es la
UNICEF
misma
was
estación por la que llegan
distributing
los insumos
humanitarian
que se
assistance.
requieren
It's
para
to this
otorgar dicha
station that
asistencia.
supplies arrive
Las
that are required
mujeres
for
y las
to
niñas
deliver
y
that
los niños de
assistance.
Ucrania están siendo los
Women
más afectados.
and children of Ukraine
Representan
are
el
the most
90%
affected. They
de la
represent
población
90%
refugiada
of the
y se
refugee
encuentran en
population,
alto riesgo de
and
tráfico y
they
explotación.
are exposed to a high risk of
Las
trafficking and
estimaciones de
exploitation.
Unicef
According to
indican que son
estimates of
casi ya
UNICEF,
2 millones de niños los
almost
que han
2
cruzado
million
fronteras
children have crossed
muchos de
the
ellos lo
border.
han hecho
Many of them
solos.
have done so but
no van
alone,
acompañados.
unaccompanied.
Y aquellos que se han quedado
And those
con
that
sus
have remained
familias
with their
o están en
families
proceso de ser
or are
evacuados
in
corren el
the course
riesgo
of
de
being
ser
evacuated,
víctimas
run the risk
del
of
uso de
becoming
armas con
victims
defectos
of the
indiscriminados.
use of weapons with indiscriminate
Tampoco debemos
effects.
olvidar
Nor should we
los
forget
severos impactos de corto y
the
largo plazo
severe impact,
que
both in the
todo
short
ello
and
tendrá
long term, that
sobre
all
la
this will
salud
have
mental.
on mental health.
Los traumas de la guerra
The traumas of war that are being suffered by so many minors as well as adults could be extremely severe and irreversible. In particular, relatives of those who have lost their lives, or survivors of attacks, displaced persons and refugees. The damage caused to the residential, educational, and sanitary infrastructure further darken this panorama. Ukrainian women have been the first ones to respond to the urgent needs in their communities. The testimonies of doctors, nurses, psychologists, and volunteers that assist the most vulnerable population, such as, for example, older adults or persons with disabilities. These are examples of solidarity. And at the same time, they are evidence of the most moving human dimension of this conflict, and they are continuing to assist people. Now we need the UN system, in particular UN Women and the Special Office of the Special Representative, Pramila Patten, to continue collecting evidence, disaggregated data, and a gender-focused analysis on the multiple dimensions of this conflict, including in particular sexual violence. We need all verified information that could be collected. And in our capacity as co-chairs of the group that oversees the agenda Women, Peace and Security, we intend to convene a follow-up meeting to maintain the focus and priority on this topic that it deserves, in addition to the differentiated impact and the particular cost borne by millions of women. It's important to increase their participation in the political process. It's urgent to include them in all possible channels of dialogue and negotiation. What happens is, just as in the rest of the world, Ukrainian women are protagonists of change, essential protagonists, and they must participate fully on an equal basis and meaningfully in the processes of decision-making and in peace negotiations. Mr. President, in conclusion, we'd like to reiterate our appeal to an immediate cessation of hostilities, to unrestricted and unconditional access to humanitarian assistance, and to finding a diplomatic solution of the conflict without any delay. Thank you very much.
I thank Mexico for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take this opportunity to welcome Your Excellency to this meeting. I would also like to thank Ms. Seema Bahos, Executive Director of UN Women, Mr. Manuel Fontaine of UNICEF, and Ms. Katerina Sherepaka of La Strada, Ukraine, for their briefings and insights into impact of the situation on women and children, particularly with respect to education. Women and children invariably suffer the most in any armed conflicts or military confrontation. From reports coming out of Ukraine, women and children have been disproportionately impacted and form the bulk of the refugees and internally displaced persons. More than 4.4 million people have moved to neighboring countries, and another 7.1 million are displaced inside Ukraine. We commend the Ukraine's neighboring countries who have welcomed refugees from Ukraine, and especially for treating women and children with compassion and dignity. As a country which has welcomed refugees over centuries, India knows the importance and value of treating them equally and with dignity and catering to their needs and requirements. In this context, we need to keep the gender perspective in mind and act with sensitivity. We call for a victim-centered approach to preventing and responding to sexual violence in armed conflicts. The impact of situation on education of children has also been severe. It has further aggravated the pandemic-related challenges that children were already facing. There are reports that more than 900 education facilities and schools have been either damaged or destroyed in Ukraine. Let us also not forget that the situation has also affected foreign students, including Indian students. India facilitated safe return of 22,500 Indian nationals, most of them students studying in various universities in Ukraine. We are exploring options to minimize the impact on our students' education. We appreciate the relaxations made by the Ukrainian government for this academic year in respect of medical students. Even as we deal with the influx of refugees, we continue to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation in Ukraine and reiterate a call for immediate end to hostilities. When innocent human lives are at stake, diplomacy must prevail as the only viable option. Since the inception of the Ukrainian conflict, India has stood for peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of human lives, especially that of women and children. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to the conflict. Allow me to reiterate the importance of the UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance once again. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. We continue to emphasize to member states that the global order is anchored on international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank India for their statement. I now invite the representative of Ireland, Your Excellency.
Thank you, President, and my thanks also to our briefers, and in particular to our civil society briefer, Katerina Cherepaka. The sobering words we've heard this morning leave us in no doubt as to the human misery and suffering inflicted upon the people of Ukraine by the Russian Federation's senseless and illegal war. We've all seen the images. We've all seen the grim realities of this war. A pregnant woman carried on a stretcher from the ruins of a maternity hospital. A young child on a train looking longingly at the father who cannot board. Bodies lying abandoned in improvised mass graves. People lying dead following the indiscriminate attack against a train station in Kramatorsk by the Russian Federation on Friday. This attack on innocent lives, mostly women and children, is yet another attempt to close escape routes for those fleeing this unjustified war and to cause human suffering. Ireland strongly condemns this and all attacks on civilians. They are just glimpses of the suffering caused by the Russian Federation's war. They tell only part of the harrowing experiences of women and children in Ukraine. Theirs is a story of widespread displacement and trauma, facing extremely serious risks of abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. Reports of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers, including rape, proliferate, with bone-chilling allegations that children are among those violated. Conflict-related sexual violence can constitute a war crime, and those responsible must be held to account. Accountability must not only be for those who physically perpetrate such acts, but also for those military commanders who fail to take all necessary and reasonable steps to stop them, or fail to ensure that they are investigated and prosecuted. Ukraine's displacement crisis deepens every day. Of those who have fled the country, 90% are women and children. The large population of older women, women with disabilities, and those of marginalised groups, including the Roma and LGBTQI+ communities, are particularly vulnerable in this conflict. Millions of women face impossible decisions around evacuation. As their lives and their families are threatened, do women journalists stay to report? Do women healthcare workers and those in caregiving roles stay or go? Do women in the Ukrainian army who choose to bring their children to safety return to defend their country? So many are making the desperate yet heroic choice to remain. President, a child protection crisis is emerging as the number of unaccompanied and separated children rises. We have a responsibility to respond. The terror of war and the trauma of family separation will have lifelong effects on millions of Ukrainian children. We need to mitigate these impacts, including through psychosocial services and mental health support, healthcare, and education in emergency settings. This month marks a year since every member of the Council co-sponsored and agreed Resolution 2573 on the protection of civilian objects. That includes the Russian Federation. That day, we sent a united message strongly condemning attacks against civilians or civilian objects. 12 months later, where is that unity on display in Ukraine? Thousands of civilian objects, including hundreds of schools and kindergartens, have been destroyed, largely due to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Attacks on schools are a grave violation. To rob children of their education has profound impacts not only on their individual development, but on society as a whole. The reverberations of this war reach far beyond Ukraine's borders. They will also reach beyond this generation. This war will mark Ukraine for many years to come. We all have a responsibility to support them long after this war has ended. At this table, we have repeatedly called for it to end, for the Russian Federation to withdraw its forces and engage in true dialogue and diplomacy towards peace. In any peace talks, we must have direct, substantive inclusion of diverse women so they can influence the course and outcome of negotiations. Without them, we can have no hope for sustainable peace. Let us not forget that Ukraine has been a society where women were fully and equally participating in public life. Targeting women through violence or forcing them to flee to save their children's lives is a double abomination in a society that was realizing the fruits of women's participation. This war will undo years of progress towards gender equality. And as my Mexican colleague referenced, we are focused on these issues also as co-chairs of the IAG on Women, Peace and Security. President, I conclude by stressing that gender equality is not an aspiration reserved for peaceful countries, somehow too difficult or inconvenient for countries in conflict. The evidence shows that women's participation in peace processes leads to better and longer-lasting agreements. The guns are still firing, with a dire impact on women. The urgency to ensure their active participation in ending this conflict has never been greater. Yet it is because of their deep-rooted participation that we are hopeful for the future that women of Ukraine can help to shape. Thank you.
I thank Ireland for their statement. I now invite the representative of Norway, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, President. And thank you to UN Women, Unicef, and Katarina Sharapaka, from whom, again, this Council has heard alarming assessments of the consequences of Russia's war. We are deeply shocked by the atrocities committed against civilians in places that have been held by Russian forces, including credible reports of extrajudicial killings of civilians. We condemn the missile attack on the railway station in Kramatorsk. These atrocities shock the conscience of humanity. The protection of civilians and the respect of human rights are not a matter of choice. These are legal obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Yet, the reality is that women and girls of Ukraine now face a drastically heightened risk of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, abuse, and trafficking. Just last week, USG Carlo briefed the Council on disturbing reports of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces, including brutal acts committed in front of children. The sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls have also been severely diminished due to displacement and the targeting destruction of health facilities. For many, including refugees, it means the near total loss of access to essential sometimes life-saving assistance. Our humanitarian response, therefore, must also be gender and age-sensitive to avoid and address protection gaps. President, in the midst of intense warfare and the calls for Russia to end the violence and negotiate in good faith, there is a tendency to forget that women are also at the front line in every way. Ukrainian women are among the combatants fighting to defend their country. They ensure delivery of basic and life-saving services, and they most definitely suffer the full consequences of war. It is therefore imperative that their rights are respected and that their full, equal, and meaningful participation is ensured in any political processes, talks, and negotiation regarding the future of Ukraine and its people. Children's lives and well-being are constantly threatened by the ravages of war. They are traumatized by violence, displacement, and the destruction of the places that they live, learn, and play. Their future is at stake. Norway is alarmed by the reports that more than 60% of Ukraine's children are now displaced as a result of Russia's illegal invasion. We call for the immediate cessation of attacks on and threats of attack against school, students, and teachers, in line with Resolution 2601 and the Safe Schools Declaration. And we recall the obligation of parties to conflict to facilitate the continuation of education. President, Norway supports the assessment by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that the ongoing violence by Russian forces raises serious and disturbing questions about possible war crimes, or even crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of international humanitarian law and serious violation of international human rights law. This underlines the importance of the ongoing investigation of the situation in Ukraine by the International Criminal Court, as well as the Human Rights Council, and their work to investigate all violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. There is no doubt that the physical and psychological wounds that this war will be felt for generations. So once again, we call on Russia to cease its attack on the Ukrainian civilian population and to stop this senseless war.
Thank Norway for their contribution. Now I invite Brazil, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to commend the work of Ms. Bauhaus and Mr. Fontaine in Ukraine and thank them for the briefings. I also thank Ms. Chedepaka for her statement. As the conflict in Ukraine persists and we enter into the 7th week of hostilities, Brazil remains deeply concerned about the daily reports of gross violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The images of violence against civilians and destruction of civilian infrastructure are deeply disturbing. The politics behind this or any other conflict should not affect the obligations of all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law. I believe there are no divergences between member states that the protection of children in armed conflicts should be a priority at all times, even when parties cannot find common ground for the peaceful settlement of their disputes. We continue to call on all parties and relevant actors to work towards well-planned and agreed-upon arrangements on the ground that provide respite for the civilian population, allow for civilians to leave conflict zones in safety, and for humanitarian assistance to reach those in need, including and very specially children. Children should never be uprooted. Their physical integrity and well-being should be a fundamental priority to all member states, especially in times of armed conflict. Schools and medical facilities should never be used for military purposes, nor should they become targets of direct attacks or indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks. It is of the utmost importance to implement Resolution 2601 on the protection of education, co-sponsored by 98 member states, including Brazil. The Safe Schools Declaration also provides important guidelines on this matter. Moreover, it is key that women and children be placed at the heart of peace negotiations to ensure their protection from hostilities, as well as the cessation of attacks against civilian infrastructure. In particular, Resolution 2573 provides fundamental guidance for the protection of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population and should be duly observed. Mr. President, reports of sexual violence are appalling and must be independently investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. Available evidence on the psychological impact of sexual violence in conflict, a crime that affects women and girls, but also men and boys, suggests that it is often lifelong and even intergenerational. Brazil reiterates its calls on all parties to cooperate with the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council so that it can fulfill its mandate and provide us with the necessary clarifications, including by identifying, where possible, those responsible for violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. In this regard, we welcome the participation of UN Women in the Commission of Inquiry, with experts skilled and experienced to investigate sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation in the context of war. We also thank UN Women for its efforts to obtain gender-sensitive data, which is essential to adequately address the situation of women and girls in Ukraine. Unicef findings show that the ongoing conflict has caused one of the fastest large-scale displacements of children since World War II, a tragedy that could have long-lasting consequences for generations to come. We worry that as more women and children are forced into the condition of refugees or internally displaced persons, they become more vulnerable to crimes, including sexual violence and exploitation. All efforts should be made to provide refugee children and adolescents with essential services, including education and mental health services. In conclusion, Brazil draws attention to the importance of the work that has been carried out on the ground to reach those most affected by the conflict in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, especially women and children. We reiterate our call on all parties to comply with their obligation to ensure free and unimpeded humanitarian access that must comply with the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Brazil for their statement. I now invite the representative of China.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
我认真听取了各位通报
I
人
have
的
listened
通报。
carefully to the briefings by all the
妇女、儿
briefings.
童最
Women
易
and
遭受
children
暴力
are
活
the
动的
most
冲击
vulnerable to
和
violence
伤害，在武装冲突
and
中
should be
应当受
given
到优
priority
先保护。
protection in armed conflicts.
我们呼吁
We
乌克兰
call
局势的
on
单事发
parties
严格遵
involved
守
in
国
the
际人道
situation
法
in，Ukraine to
切
strictly
实保
abide
护
by
妇女、
international
儿
humanitarian
童
law,
人身安全，
effectively protect the
尊重并
personal
保
safety
障
of women
学
and
校、
children,
医院等
respect
设
and
施的
guarantee
民
the
用属
civilian
性
nature and
和
safety
安
of
全，
facilities such as
在
schools and
疏散、
hospitals,
救援、
and
医疗
provide
救助
special
等
care
方
to
面
women
对
and
妇女、
children
儿童
in
给
evacuation,
予特
rescue,
殊照
and
顾。
medical assistance.
中方对
China
克拉马托尔斯克
deplores
火
that
车站的
dozens of
袭击，
civilians,
造成
including
包
women
括
and
妇女、
children,
儿
were
童在
killed
内
or
数
injured
十
in the
名
attack
平民
on
伤亡，
Kramatorsk
感到
train
痛惜。
station.
事件的
The
相关
relevant
情况和具体
circumstances and
原因
specific cause
必
for
须
the
查
incident
清，
must be
任何
investigated,
指
and
控
any
都应
claim
以
should
事
be
实
based on
为依据
facts.。
冲突发生以
Since
来
the，conflicts
有
broke
大量
out,
妇女、
a large
儿
number
童
of
从乌
Ukrainian
克兰
women
进入
and
周边
children
国家
have
避
taken
难。
refuge in neighboring
中方
countries.
赞赏
China
有关邻
appreciates
国
these
和
neighboring
其
countries
他
and
国
other
家
countries
向
for
他们打
opening
开
their
边境，
borders to them
并为
and
其提
providing
供
them with
安全
refuge
庇护
and
和人道
humanitarian
救援。
assistance.
所有难
All
民无论
refugees,
肤色、
regardless
种
of
族、
color,
宗教
race,
信
or
仰，
religion,
根据国际
should
法
receive
都
the
应获得
necessary
必
and
要和
equal
平等的保
protection
护。
under international refugee law.
乌克兰和周
The
边国家人道
humanitarian
需
needs
求
of
依然
Ukraine
巨大。
and neighboring countries
联合国
remain
人道协调
large.
办公室、
International agencies
妇女
such as
署、
UN OCHA,
儿基
UN
会
Women,
等
and
国际机
Unicef
构
should
应继
continue
续
to
动员
mobilize
协
and
调国
coordinate
际支持，
international support for
向
humanitarian
所有有
assistance
需要的
to
人
all
提
those
供
in
人
need.
道救助。特别要考
The
虑
special needs of
妇
women
女、
and
儿
children
童的
should be
特殊需
considered,
求，提供
and
有针对
targeted
性的
medical
医疗救
treatment,
治、心理疏
psychological
导和
counseling,
社会
and
服
social
务，
services should
保
be
障儿
provided to
童
them,
受教育
and
的权
children's
利。
right to education should be
我
ensured.
们对有关寻求
We are
避难的
deeply
妇女、
concerned
儿
about
童
reports
被
that
拐
women
卖
and children
和受
seeking
侵害的
asylum
报
were
道
subject to
深表
abduction,
关切
human，trafficking, and
呼吁妇女署、
violence.
儿基
We
会
call on、
难民
international
署、
agencies
人
such as
权
UN
高专
Women,
办
Unicef,
等国际机构
UNHCR,
加
and
强监测，
OHCHR to strengthen
支持
monitoring
有关国
and
家
support
采
relevant
取措
countries to
施，
take measures
坚
to
决防止他
resolutely
们遭
prevent
受
this
二
group
次
of people
伤
from
害。
being harmed the second time.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
尽快让战火
only
平
by
歇，
calming the
才
war
能从
as soon
根
as
本上
possible
解
can we
决
fundamentally
乌克
solve
兰
the
人道危
humanitarian
机，
crisis in
使
Ukraine
妇女儿
and
童
keep women
远
and
离
children
暴力伤
away
害。
from violence.
对话谈判是
Dialogue
通
and
向和平
negotiation
大
are the
门的
only
唯一
way
出
to
路。
peace.
我们支
We
持单事
support
方
the
继续
parties
开展
involved
谈判，
continue
努力克
negotiations,
服困
strive
难
to
和
overcome
分歧，
difficulties and
为
differences,
达成停
create
火积累
conditions
条
for a
件，
ceasefire,
为妇
and
女
make
儿童
positive
能够
efforts
早
so
日
that
看到
women and
和
children
平
can
曙
see the
光，
dawn of peace
做
at
出
an
积极
early
努力
date.
国际社
All
会
other
其他
parties
各
in the
方
international
都要多
community
做
should do
有
more
利
to
于对话
facilitate
谈判
dialogue
的事，
and negotiations
为
and
谈判
create
取
the
得进展
necessary
营造必
environment
要
and
环境
condition
和
for
条件。
progress in the negotiations.
必须指出，
I must point out
一味
that
实施制
simply
裁、
imposing
输送武
sanctions
器
and
不会
sending
带来
weapons
和
will
平。
not bring peace.
不断升
The
级的全方位
escalating,
无底
extensive,
线
and
制裁，引
indiscriminate
发
sanctions
粮
have
食、能源
triggered
危机
food and energy
和
crisis
生
and
活必
soaring
需品
prices
价
of
格
daily
飞涨，
necessities,
让全
which
世
the
界人
entire
民
world
为此付
population
出沉
paid
重
a
代价，
heavy price for,
更让阿富
including
汗、
the
也
tens of
门、
millions of
非洲
women
自
and
角、
children in
萨赫勒地
Afghanistan,
区数
Yemen, the
千万
Horn
的
of
妇女
Africa,
儿
the
童
Sahel,
成为
who have
严重
become
受害
its
者。
worst victims.
中方再次
China
呼
once
吁
again
各方
calls
保
on
持
all
理
parties
性
to
克制，
exercise restraint,
采取负责
adopt a
任态度，
responsible attitude,
为妥
and
善
make
解决乌克兰
constructive
危机
efforts to properly
早日
resolve the
恢复
crisis in
和平
Ukraine
做
and
出建
restore
设性
peace
努力。
at an early date.
谢谢主席。
I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank China for their statement, and I now invite the representative of the United Arab Emirates, Your Excellency.
Mr. President, Lord Ahmed, I'd like to begin by thanking you and welcoming you for chairing this meeting. I'd also like to thank Ms. Bahous, Mr. Fontaine, and Ms. Cherapacha for their briefings and insights shared. Mr. President, when this Council adopted the Women, Peace and Security Agenda more than 21 years ago, it recognized the disproportionate impact of conflict on women and girls. Women are not only exposed to grave violations of international humanitarian law, but are particularly vulnerable to gender-specific risks as well. However, the WPS agenda also recognized that women and girls are active agents of peace who can drive efforts and provide solutions. Their participation in conflict prevention, peace building, reconciliation, and reconstruction must be guaranteed, not only because of the impact the conflict has on them, but also because it has proved to result in more sustainable and longer-lasting peace. Since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of the 4.3 million people people who have fled to neighboring countries are women and children. There have been deeply disturbing reports of conflict-related sexual violence and those who have fallen prey to criminal organized gangs running human and sex trafficking rings. According to the WHO, there have been 89 healthcare facilities across the country impacted by attacks, undermining the right of women and girls to access healthcare. This contributes to a lack of critical maternity care for pregnant women, both within Ukraine and for those fleeing abroad, as the UNFPA has warned. Finally, the conflict is disrupting children's access to education. Every child has a right to education, and this can further block their opportunities and capabilities to contribute to Ukraine's future. This risks a generational effect. Accordingly, the UAE would like to highlight 3 areas to support women and children impacted by the war in Ukraine. First, we see the ongoing negotiations between the parties as a positive development, and we call on them to guarantee women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all peace efforts. It is imperative that women's leadership and participation not only take place at the end of the conflict, but also in the design and implementation processes for its peaceful resolution. Women have been leading local reconciliation and dialogue efforts for many years now in eastern Ukraine. These efforts should not be forgotten. Rather, they should be recognized, built upon, and mobilized to drive efforts towards peace. Second, sex disaggregated data collection on the impact of the conflict remains a valuable tool, including in strengthening accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. This can ensure that restorative justice can be achieved. Third, a gender-responsive approach must be implemented in all humanitarian efforts during and after the conflict. This should include the voices of women who can inform the provision and delivery of humanitarian assistance, services, and programming efforts with their needs at the center. We also call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, in particular, the protection of civilians, and to allow timely and unimpeded humanitarian access. Mr. President, I want to also highlight the disproportionate consequences this war has on women and children around the world. From food insecurity to high commodity prices, women and girls worldwide are seeing their daily lives and their futures upended. More than ever, we need concerted efforts to prevent that from happening. The stakes are too high. In conclusion, we reiterate our strong call for an immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine to allow for constructive dialogue between the parties and to end the suffering caused by this conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I now invite the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour votre leadership dans la conduite de nos travaux. Je remercie Madame Sima Baous et Monsieur Manuel Fontaine pour leurs exposés. Je remercie également Madame Katerina Cherpaka. Monsieur le Président, l'escalade dévastatrice de la violence en Ukraine porte atteinte à la sécurité des femmes et des enfants, qui représentent aujourd'hui la plus grande proportion des populations civiles qui fuient en masse les zones de combat ou se terrent dans des abris de fortune, souvent dans des conditions inhumaines. Le nombre de personnes déplacées augmente au rythme de l'intensification des combats. Il atteint à présent la dizaine de millions, parmi lesquels d'innombrables enfants qui ont traversé les frontières de l'Ukraine sans être accompagnés. Des témoignages persistants font état de violence et de viols à l'égard des femmes et des filles. Le témoignage de M. Fontaine de l'Unicef sur des réseaux de traite des personnes humaines est alarmant. Les violences sexuelles contre les femmes et la traite des êtres humains sont inacceptables. Il est crucial que des enquêtes indépendantes et impartiales soient diligentées pour établir les faits et les responsabilités. Monsieur le Président, alors que la guerre s'enlise, les attaques contre les infrastructures civiles, donc les établissements de santé et les écoles, affectent considérablement l'accès des populations à l'eau potable et aux soins de santé primaires et spécialisés. La baisse de la couverture vaccinale de routine fait craindre la résurgence de certaines maladies infantiles. De même, les mouvements massifs des populations, les ruptures d'approvisionnement, la détérioration des conditions d'hygiène, ainsi que la promiscuité constituent des conditions propices au développement des épidémies. Monsieur le Président, cette guerre doit cesser.
Des actions urgentes doivent être prises pour répondre aux besoins importants des populations civiles et en particulier les femmes et les enfants. Nous notons avec intérêt le renforcement par l'Unicef de ses équipes mobiles et de l'augmentation de ses fournitures en produits de première nécessité et en services essentiels en vue d'atténuer les souffrances et accroître la protection des enfants dans les zones de conflit. Il est urgent que l'aide apportée aux femmes et aux enfants soit renforcée, y compris par des soins de santé mentale et émotionnelle et un soutien psychosocial. Des dispositifs de protection spécifiques aux femmes et aux enfants doivent également être mis en place pour prévenir les risques de traite de personnes. Je voudrais réitérer toute l'appréciation de mon pays au travail des humanitaires qui sont aux avant-postes dans les lieux de combat, parfois au péril de leur vie, pour secourir et protéger les civils. Nous appelons les parties à leur faciliter l'accès à toutes les localités dans lesquelles l'aide humanitaire est devenue vitale. Mon pays appelle à un cessez-le-feu et à l'ouverture de couloirs humanitaires dans l'ensemble des localités en vue de la fourniture de l'aide humanitaire dans des conditions optimales de sécurité. Aussi longtemps que les travailleurs humanitaires ne pourront accéder à ceux qui ont besoin de cette aide d'urgence, des personnes continueront de mourir, aussi bien des balles que de la faim et des maladies. Je voudrais à nouveau réitérer l'appréciation de mon pays en direction des pays voisins de l'Ukraine qui continuent de se mobiliser pour l'accueil d'urgence des réfugiés. Nous les encourageons à accorder le même accueil à toutes les personnes en détresse sans distinction. Nous demandons le respect de leur dignité et appelons à un traitement équitable de toutes les personnes en détresse. Je voudrais également réitérer l'appel aux partis à s'engager de bonne foi dans le dialogue en vue de mettre un terme aux hostilités. Nous demandons aux belligérants de se conformer à leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Monsieur le Président, cette guerre doit cesser. Elle est insoutenable, elle est déshumanisante. Elle doit cesser immédiatement. Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I thank Gabon for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Your Excellency.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr.
Благодарим
President.
сегодняшних
We're
докладчиков за
grateful to
предоставленную
today's
информацию.
briefers for the information.
Коллеги, мы не сомневались, что сегодня со
We
стороны
had no
наших западных
doubt
коллег
that today our
вновь прозвучит
Western colleagues
множество
would once
измышлений в отношении того, что сейчас
again
происходит на Украине
voice all
в
kinds
свете
of
проводимой нами
ideas
специальной
about
военной
what is
операции.
taking place in Ukraine in light of the special military
Алгоритм ваших
operation that we're
действий нам давно
conducting.
понятен.
We are very familiar with
Извратить и
the
очернить
algorithm
цели
of
СВО,
your MO, and
замолчать
that is to
неудобные для вас
distort
факты,
and
продвинуть
discredit the
фейки и
special military
пропагандистские
operation,
наработки
to remain
Украины
silent
и
about
работающие на
inconvenient
киевских режим
facts and
профессиональных
promote the
западных
fakes
пиарщиков.
and propaganda efforts of Ukraine and those professional PR experts
Все ваши
working
усилия
for the
логично
regime.
вписываются
All
в
your
логику,
efforts are
развязанную
fully
в
in
отношении
line with
России
the logic
информационной
of the
войны,
information war
которая по
unleashed
своей
against
интенсивности не
Russia.
уступает боевым
That
действиям на
war is
земле.
as intense as the military operations on the ground.
Новую планку дезинформации
Now, a new threshold of
задают сегодня наши
disinformation
албанские коллеги.
has been set by our Albanian colleague.
Постред Албании сегодня перечислил
The
почти
permanent
весь список
representative of Albania has
приписываемых
listed the
нам
almost the
преступлений,
entire list of crimes that are ascribed to us,
не потрудившись упомянуть, что ни
without
по одному из
even
них так и не
taking the
было представлено
time
хоть
to
сколько-нибудь
mention that
убедительных доказательств.
no convincing evidence has been presented for any of these crimes.
Понятно, что презумпцию
It's
невиновности вы уже
understandable
давно
that
растоптали.
you have trampled on the presumption of innocence a long time ago.
За последнее время
Now,
совместная западная и украинская фабрика по производству фейков
Joint
вышла на новый
Ukrainian and
уровень
Western industry for the creation of fakes has reached a
и
new
приступила к
level
фабрикации и
and
постановкам
has
в лучших
started
традициях печально
creating
известных
fabrications and
британско-сирийских
staging
белых
events
касок.
in the best traditions of the infamous British-Syrian white helmets.
У всех до сих пор на слуху
Everyone is still
беспрецедентное
hearing about the
как по своей
unprecedented,
жестокости,
both in its
так и
cruelty
по
as
топорности
well as in its
исполнения
crudeness and the way it was
провокация
performed, the
в городе Буча
provocation in the
Киевской
city of
области.
Bucha in the Kiev Oblast. Ее пока еще продвигают в качестве якобы совершенного российской армией преступления. Несмотря на неопровержимые свидетельства о постановочном характере произошедшего, которые только множатся. Не буду останавливаться на деталях. Об основных из них мы подробно информировали Совет Безопасности в прошлый вторник. После того, как британское председательство в нарушении базовых правил процедуры Совета сделало все, чтобы не допустить проведения отдельного заседания по этой провокации. Скажу только, что при тщательном анализе действий укронацистов
after a thorough analysis of the actions of the
дежавю.
Ukrainian Nazis, it's hard to shake a sense of déjà vu.
В 1944 году
In
идейные
1944,
учителя
the
киевских
intellectual
радикалов,
forefathers of the
действуя в
Kiev
лучших
radicals,
традициях
acting in
главного
the best
гитлеровского
traditions
пропагандиста
of the main
устроили
Hitler
провокацию с
propaganda czar
якобы зверски убитыми
Goebbels, organized a
красноармейцами в
provocation with the
деревне
supposedly
Немерсдорф,
brutally murdered
Восточной Пруссии, мирными
civilians
жителями.
by Red Army soldiers in the town of Nemmersdorf in Eastern Prussia.
Этому предшествовал циркуляр,
That was preceded by a
разосланный в крупнейшие
circular letter
немецкие
sent to
газеты,
the
в котором подробно
biggest
описывалось,
German newspapers,
как лучше
which
преподнести якобы
described in
злодеяния
detail
советских
how
солдат.
best to present the so-called atrocities of the Soviet
В наше
soldiers.
время газеты читают все меньше.
Today, people read the
И подобные
newspapers less and
руководства
less, and
появляются в
such
соцсетях.
guidelines are appearing
Причем
on
их даже
social
особо не
media,
скрывают.
and there's no particular attempt to even conceal them.
Набирают артистов для
Creators
массовок,
are recruited for crowd scenes,
ориентируют на
given
каких моментах следует
instructions
остановиться.
on what aspects to focus on.
Одним словом,
In
Геббельс
other
был бы
words,
доволен размахом
Goebbels
своих
would have
украинских
been very
последователей.
happy with the ambition of his
Однако их подвело
Ukrainian
исполнение.
descendants. However, they were betrayed by the quality of their
Инсценировки в
performance.
Немерсдорфе,
The staged
нацеленные на
events in
создание легенды
Nemmersdorf
о
aimed at
якобы
creating the
совершенных красноармейцами массовых
legend
убийствах
about
и
the
изнасилованиях,
so-called
впоследствии были
mass
убедительно опровергнуты
murders and
различными
rapes by
экспертами.
the Red Army were subsequently
А имя
and
поселка стало
convincingly
нарицательным
debunked by
для
various
обозначения
experts. And the
грубой
name of the
пропагандистской
town became
инсценировки.
synonymous with the crude propaganda stunt,
Точно как та, которую
just
реализовали в Буче.
as the one that was organized in Bucha.
Однако бучинскую
However, the
провокацию
Bucha
на уходящей
provocation
неделе
last
затмила
week was
другая,
overshadowed by another
которую
one,
укронацисты
which
реализовали в пока еще
Ukrainian
находящихся под им
Nazis
контролем
organized
Краматорске.
in the town of Kramatorsk, which for the time being is still under their
Это
control.
классическая операция под
This
чужим
is
флагом.
a classic false flag
Остановлюсь
operation.
над ней
I'll
подробнее,
dwell
тем более, что
on
многие ее
it in
сегодня
a little more
упоминали.
detail, especially since many mentioned it today.
8 апреля из
On the 8th
окрестностей
of
населенного
April,
пункта
from
Доброполья,
the area around the
45
town
километров
of
к юго-западу от
Dobropolye, in
Краматорска,
45 kilometers to the southwest
украинские
of
вооруженные силы
Kramatorsk,
нанесли
the
удар
Ukrainian armed
тактической
forces
ракетой .У
conducted a strike
по
using
железнодорожному
the
вокзалу
rocket
города
.U
Краматорска.
on the main railroad station of the town of
Погибло более
Kramatorsk.
50 человек,
Over
из них
50
5
people were
дети.
killed, including 5 children.
В больнице Краматорска были доставлены 98 человек,
98 people were
среди
wounded, were
которых 16
delivered to the
детей,
hospitals of
46
Kramatorsk,
женщин
including
и
16
36
children,
мужчин.
46 women, and 36 men.
Почему мы с такой уверенностью
Why
говорим об
are we
ответственности
speaking,
именно украинских, а не
why are we so
российских
sure about the
военных, как это
responsibility
сразу
of
же показали западные СМИ,
Ukrainians rather than
и как
Russian
об этом сегодня говорил ряд наших
army,
коллег?
as was immediately stated by the
По
Western
нескольким причинам.
media? For several reasons.
Назову 3 из них.
I'll mention 3 of them.
Во-первых, на вооружении
First of all,
российской армии не
the Russian
имеется
army
тактического
doesn't
ракетного
have
комплекса
tactical
.У.
missile systems .U.
Они устарели,
They're obsolete.
были давно
They have
заменены
been
на Искандеры и
replaced
активно
by
используются только
Iskander
армией
rockets a long
Украины.
time ago and are only actively used by the Ukrainian
Во-вторых,
army.
сделанные по
Second,
горячим следам
the
еще до
pictures
прибытия
taken
украинских
by
пропагандистов,
witnesses shortly after the strike and before the arrival of Ukrainian
позволили
propagandists
безошибочно
made it
определить не
possible
только
to
тип
unequivocally
ракеты,
determine
но и
not only the
направление,
type of rocket,
откуда
but
она
the
прилетела.
direction from which it was launched.
И этот район пока удерживается
And
украинскими
that
войсками.
area is under the control for the time being of the Ukrainian army.
Наконец, в-третьих, по тем же
Lastly,
снимкам
thirdly,
легко
using the same pictures,
идентифицируется
it's
номер
easy to
точки У.
identify the serial number of the .U rocket.
Она относится к серии
It is
Ш-915.
part of the series Sh-915.
Ракетами из этой же серии неоднократно
Rockets from
обстреливались
this
мирные города
serial
Донбасса.
group were regularly used to shell the cities of the
Есть их обломки с
Donbass.
соответствующими
There are
номерами.
fragments from those
those rockets with the same serial number.
Таким же боеприпасом
The
14
same type
марта
of rocket was used on the 14th of March by the 19th Separate Rocket Brigade by the Ukrainian army to conduct a rocket strike against the center of Donetsk. 21 inhabitants of Donetsk were killed, 36 were wounded. The horrific pictures of that strike are still continue to be passed off by Western media as the shelling of Kiev.
В общем, провокация в Краматорске киевскому режиму также не
The
удалась.
provocation in Kramatorsk was not very successful
Но
either.
украинские пропагандисты
However,
явно
Ukrainian
пытаются учесть свои ошибки и
propagandists
сработать
clearly are
чище.
trying to learn from their mistakes and to work better.
Они очень стараются.
They're really trying hard.
Только за последние дни мы
Just over the
передали в
past few
ООН
days, we have
информацию о следующих
transmitted to the UN
готовящихся
information
провокациях.
on the following provocations that are being prepared.
Постановочное обнаружение
A
массовых
staged
захоронений в
discovery
селе
of mass
Раковка под
graves in the
Киевом.
town of Rakovka near Kiev.
В город Кременная заблаговременно прибыли репортеры зарубежных
Western
СМИ.
journalists have arrived in the town of Kremenaya.
Их цель зафиксировать
Their goal is to
подготовленную ВСУ
report
провокацию
on
с
the
обстрелом
prepared
якобы российской
provocation by
армии
the Ukrainian
автомобилей скорой
army
помощи,
of a
которые
supposed
перевозят
shelling
пациентов.
by the Russian army of ambulances transporting patients.
В селе
In the
Белогоровка
town of
заминированы
Belogorovka,
резервуары с
a
хлором на
chlorine
территории
reserve has
водоканала,
been mined on the territory
который
of a water
планируется
canal.
взорвать
The
при
plan is
подходе
to
к
blow
городу
it up
формирования народной милиции ЛНР.
when units of the national militia of the Luhansk People's
В городе
army
Ирпень
approach.
Киевской области
In the town
осуществляется
of
провокация
Irpen
по
in the
схеме
Kiev
Бучи и Немерсдорфа.
region, a provocation using the same script as in Bucha and Nemersdorf is being
Сотрудники
prepared.
СБУ планируют привезти из морга
Members of
при городской
Ukrainian
больнице на
security
улице
forces
Полевой
intend to transport
подвал
bodies
одного из
from
зданий на
the
восточной окраине
morgue of a
города
local
тела
hospital
погибших от обстрелов
and
артиллерии
put them in the
мирных жителей.
basement in the suburb of the town.
Затем в Пущеводицком лесном
The bodies-
массиве СБУ будет
Then,
организована постановочная акция со стрельбой и уничтожением
Then
якобы
the
российской
Ukrainian
разведывательной
forces
группы,
will organize a staged
прибывшей в
event
Ирпень для убийства
of
свидетелей якобы военных
shooting
преступлений
and
России.
elimination of supposed special operation group from
При
Russia
этом в
that came
качестве
from
бесспорных
Irpin to
доказательств
kill
в лесу
witnesses
будут
of
представлены тела ранее
Russian
убитых
war
националистами под
crimes. At the
пытками
same
пленных
time, as
российских
undisputed,
военнослужащих.
quote-unquote, undisputed evidence, bodies of Russian soldiers taken prisoner and killed by Ukrainian nationalists under torture will be placed there.
Ждем распространения
We
видеоматериалов от этой
expect the
постановочной акции
circulation of
западными СМИ.
videos from the stage event by Western media.
Вот только сегодня Министерство
Just
обороны
today,
Российской
the
Федерации
Ministry of Defense of the Russian
озвучило, что в
Federation
город середина
stated
Буда в
that
Сумской области,
in the Sumy region, the
ранее
town,
находившийся
in
под
one of the
контролем
towns which
российских
was
войск,
earlier under the
приглашены
control of the
представители
Russian
западных и
forces,
украинских СМИ для проведения
Western
постановочных
media have
видеосюжетов.
been invited to organize a staged event.
В населенном пункте Нижняя
In the
Сыроватка
town
под
of
Сумами
Nizhnya Saravatka, next
в один
to
из подвалов
Suma, in one of the
стаскиваются тела.
basements, bodies are being carried to be
Постановкой
placed in one of
сюжета
the
о якобы
basements.
зверствах российской армии
The staging of the
занимаются
so-called
британские
atrocities
режиссеры.
of the Russian army are being conducted by British film directors.
Российские войска, напоминаю, покинули этот город 3 недели назад.
Russian forces, I just want to remind you, left that town 3 weeks ago.
Все эти сообщения поступают нам
All
от
these reports
жителей,
are coming
которые
from,
находятся в этих местах и которые
from the inhabitants of
неравнодушны
these towns,
к целям нашей военной операции.
residents, and who obviously are not indifferent to the aims of our military
Не могу
operation.
также не сказать о
I
сообщениях
also
от
can't forget about
одесситов,
reports from residents of Odessa.
о том, что в городе в большом
that,
количестве замечены бойцы ВСУ,
There are many members of the Ukrainian army that have been
переодетые в
noticed
российскую
there
военную форму.
wearing Russian military uniforms.
Похоже, что в этом городе
It seems
также
that
готовится
a
масштабная и
large-scale and bloody
кровавая провокация, точнее
provocation is
операция
being
под чужим
prepared in
флагом.
that city, or rather a false flag operation.
Коллеги, не говорите потом, что мы вас
Colleagues,
об этом не
please
предупреждали.
don't tell us later that we didn't warn you about this.
Уже осуществленные и планирующиеся
The
провокации в
already
сочетании
organized
с
and planned
составшей уже нарицательной
provocations,
практикой использования националистами
along
мирного
with
населения
the
в
widespread
качестве живого
practice of
щита,
using by using
поражают
civilians as a human
бесчеловечным отношением
shield
к судьбам
are
народа Украины
shocking by their inhumane attitude
и
to the fate
свидетельствуют
of
о
the people
полном
of
пренебрежении
Ukraine, and are a
укронацистами
testimony
нормами
of the
морали
complete disregard
и
by
международного гуманитарного
Ukrainian
права.
Nazis of the norms of morality and international humanitarian
Россия,
law.
как мы неоднократно
Russia,
говорили,
as we
с
have
мирным
stated more
украинским
than once,
населением не
does
воюет.
not wage war against the civilian population. Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
поскольку наше сегодняшнее заседание
since
проходит в том
today's
числе по теме
meeting
«Женщины, мир
is
и
also on the
безопасность»,
topic of
не могу
women, peace, and
обойти и этот
security,
сюжет.
I feel duty-bound to comment on this topic as well.
Применительно к Украине,
As it
он,
applies
конечно
to the
же, также
Ukraine,
крайне
of course,
идеологизирован
it has
и
also
пронизан провокациями.
been determined by ideology and full of provocations.
Видим четкое
We see
стремление
a clear
представить
intention
российских
to
солдат
present
садистами
Russian
и
soldiers as
насильниками.
sadists and rapists.
Как и в свое
Just
время
as in the
садистами и
past,
насильниками стали
the
пытаться представить
Soviet
советских
soldiers,
солдат-победителей во Второй
victors of the
мировой
World
войне.
War II, were presented as sadists and rapists.
Видим, что не меняются ни цели,
We see
ни
that neither
русофобский
the
заряд,
goals
доставшихся
or
Украине по наследству
the
пропагандистских
Russophobia
методичек.
of the propaganda methods inherited by Ukraine has changed.
Действительность, однако, свидетельствует
However,
совсем о другом.
reality is quite different.
Несмотря на все
In
исхищрения,
spite of
даже до
attempts to
западного
distort,
читателя временами
even
доходит
Western
информация
audiences
о
sometimes get
зверских пытках
information
мирного
about the
населения
brutal
садистами из
torturing of
украинских
peaceful
националистических
civilians by
батальонов,
sadists from
жертвами
Ukrainian
которых
nationalist
становятся в том числе и
battalions.
женщины.
And women have also become
Так,
victims
увиденное
of
в
such
здании начальной
atrocities. For
школы номер
example,
18 города
in
Мариуполя,
the
которая
building
долгое
of
время
primary school number
удерживалась
18 of
нацистским батальоном
Mariupol, which
Азов,
was held for a long time by the
шокировала
Nazi
даже
battalion
видавших виды
Azov.
военных.
Even seasoned soldiers were shocked by what they
На
saw
полу в
when they
углу
got
подвала
there.
тело женщины.
On the floor in the corner of a basement there was the body of a
Руки
woman.
отсечены,
Her hands
лицо
had been hacked
изуродовано.
off, her face
На животе
maimed,
выжжена свастика.
and a swastika was burned into her stomach.
Примечательно,
It's
что эти
noteworthy that these horrific
ужасающие и уже публиковавшиеся фотосвидетельства
and
на
published
Украине и на
photographic
Западе,
evidence
некоторые и сейчас
in
пытаются
Ukraine
выдать
and the
преступления
West are still
российских
being
военных.
passed off as Russian war crimes.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
украинское общество последовательно
Ukrainian
обрабатывалось
society has
националистами в течение как
consistently
минимум
been
8
under
лет.
the influence of nationalists as a minimum for the past 8 years.
Поэтому и украинские
This is
женщины, к
why,
сожалению, порой
unfortunately,
предстают в довольно
Ukrainian
странном,
women,
я бы даже
unfortunately,
сказал,
are
диковатом
presented in a
образе.
very strange and I would say even savage light.
Лучше всего это
This is
иллюстрирует
best
патриотический
illustrated by the
видеоролик,
patriotic
активно
video,
распространяемый по
which has
соцсетям в
actively
последние дни.
been disseminated on social media in the past few days.
На нем одна из
It shows
западноукраинских актрис
a Western Ukrainian actress
под патриотические речевки и проклятия в адрес
while
России
uttering chants and curses against Russia
серпом
as
перерезает
she's
горло
using
замученному
a
российскому
sickle
солдату.
to cut the throat of a tortured Russian soldier.
Единственное, с чем этот ролик вызывает
Now,
ассоциации,
the only association that this
так это
video
с
brings to
террористами
mind
из ИГИЛ,
is the terrorists of ISIL,
которые также распространяли
which also
видео,
circulated
на
videos
которых они перерезают горло своим жертвам.
on which they cut the throats of their victims.
Печально, что
It's
Украина
sad that
докатилась до
Ukraine
подобной
has
безудержной
reached the
жестокости,
depths of such unbridled cruelty,
до слепого, не
the
отстающего
depths of
от
such
игиловского
blind
радикализма и
radicalism
экстремизма.
that is in line with ISIL and extremism as well.
Видя это, лишь
So
убеждаешься
seeing
в
this, we're
необходимости и
only further
безальтернативности
convinced
осуществляемой
of
Россией
the
специальной
necessity
военной операции.
of the special military operation conducted by Russia and that we had no other choice.
Операция необходимая ради будущего Украины,
The operation is necessary for the
а также
future of
безопасности не
Ukraine
только России,
and for
но
the
и всех
security not
других
only of
соседей
Russia,
Украины.
but of all the neighbors of Ukraine.
Вряд ли, например, мирные
For example, I
поляки
very much doubt that peaceful
могут чувствовать себя
Poles
спокойно в условиях,
can feel safe in a
когда
situation
устроители Волынской
where
резни,
the
унесшие
perpetrators
жизни
of the
десятков тысяч
Volhynia
их
massacre,
соотечественников в
which took the
1943
lives
году,
of tens of thousands of Poles in
сегодня почитаются на
1943,
Украине в
are
качестве
hailed
национальных героев.
today as national heroes.
Я говорю именно о
I'm
мирных
speaking
поляках,
specifically
а
of
не об
peaceful Poles
ослепленных
rather
русофобией
than
и польских властях,
the Polish authorities who've
политика
been
которых
blinded
давно
by
уже потеряла
Russophobia.
здравый смысл.
Their policies have lost any degree of common sense a long time ago.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
завершить хотелось бы на
in
более
conclusion,
оптимистичной
I'd
ноте.
like to say something more optimistic,
Есть, разумеется, и другая Украина,
There is another
получающая
Ukraine,
благодаря нашей военной
which is
операции новый шанс на
being
мирную
given
жизнь
another chance for peace
и
and good
подлинное
neighborly
добрососедство.
relations thanks to our special military operation.
У этой Украины уже появляются
That
свои символы,
Ukraine
в том
is
числе и женщины.
already gaining its own symbols, including
Так,
women.
мало кого оставил равнодушным широко
For example,
разошедшийся
few were
по
left
соцсетям видеоролик,
indifferent by the widely circulated video
снятый вошедшими
circulated
в одно
on
из селений
social media,
украинскими
which
солдатами.
was filmed in one of the villages where Ukrainian army entered.
Вышедшая им навстречу старенькая
a very
бабушка
elderly woman, a babushka,
ошибочно
came
принимает их за
to greet
россиян
them, and she mistakes them for Russian soldiers.
и берет с собой красное
So
советское
she
знамя
brings
победы.
out the red Soviet flag of victory.
Говорит им добрые слова о том, как долго она
She
ждала
greets them
освобождения.
and tells them happily how long she's waited for liberation by them.
Солдаты, надо отдать им должное,
Soldiers,
бабушку, несмотря на это, не обижают.
we have to pay them their due. Do not harm the old
Дают ей
lady.
пакет с продуктами.
Quite to the contrary, they gave her a bag full of food.
Но взамен забирают
However,
знамя и
in
начинают его
exchange, they
топтать.
take the flag and start stomping on it.
И тогда бабушка,
And then
поняв
the
свою
old
ошибку,
lady, realizing her
демонстративно
mistake,
возвращает им продукты
demonstratively returns the bag with food
и
to the
требует вернуть
soldiers
знамя,
and
за которое
demands
воевали
that
ее
the
родители.
flag, that they return the flag under which her parents fought.
Дальше ролик обрывается.
The video ends there.
Очень хочется верить, что с бабушкой ничего
We
не
very much
случилось.
want to believe that nothing happened to the old
Ведь
lady,
ее подвиг и смелость уже
because her
вдохновили многих.
brave act and courage have inspired many people already.
Хочется также верить,
We also want to
что уже совсем
believe
скоро она
that
дождется освобождения
very soon she will live to see her liberation
и сможет без опаски вынести
and
из
will
дома
be able
красное знамя.
to bring out that red flag without
И
fear
священный для всех нас День
on the
Победы
day of victory,
почтить
sacred
память
to
своих
all of us,
родителей
to
и тех,
honor
кто
the memory
освобождал
of her
Украину от
parents
нацистов,
and those who liberated Ukraine from the Nazis,
не боясь при этом, что кто-то будет топтаться на
without
этом
fearing
знамени.
that someone will stomp on that flag.
Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
I note the contribution from the Russian representative. I now invite the representative of Kenya, Mr. Ambassador. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome back to New York. I thank USG and UN Women Executive Director Sima Bahous, UNICEF's Director of Emergencies Manuel Fontaine, and Ms. Katerina Cherepaka for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine and the permanent representatives of the affected countries in the region. Mr. President, we would not be here having this discussion but for the armed breach of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. We must again observe and condemn the continuing disregard for international law and the United Nations Charter and the anarchic, dangerous world that has resulted. Kenya further condemns the recent bombing of the train station in Kramatorsk, where more than 50 people were killed as they attempted to flee the war. This war is causing massive civilian suffering. We do not have an accurate count of the lives lost to violence, but they must be in the thousands. We have no figure for the instances of rape and other forms of sexual violence against girls and women, but it is certain that the number is high and rising. We know that the overwhelming majority of refugees who have fled Ukraine are girls and women, and we also know that each one of them, in their own special way, has had their life shattered by this war. We know that such forced human movement and family separations increase the potentials for sexual abuse, exploitation, and human trafficking. We must commend all the individuals and institutions and governments that are helping in every possible way. We especially thank those UN organizations such as UN Women, OCHA, UNICEF, UNHCR, UNFPA, and other agencies for their reports that highlight the key areas of concern for Ukrainian women and girls. More than that, we thank them for the actions they're taking to help women and girls fleeing and trying to survive this war. We also applaud today the brave women of Ukraine who are fighting for peace and for their country. We recognize with admiration the women who are leading in government and civil society in pushing us all to a peaceful resolution of the war. Mr. President, in the last year, our delegation has been in the Security Council. We have spoken regularly about women, peace, and security. Most often, it has been to applaud the role of women as peace builders and to urge their participation in decision-making at all levels. Today, I urge that we let the full weight of the suffering of women in Ukraine to settle in our minds. Perhaps then we will have the will as the Security Council and the international community to attain a ceasefire, and the boldness of vision to undertake a diplomatic dialogue that can provide lasting security in Europe and globally. The victims that I'm speaking about are fleeing bombs and bullets overwhelmingly fired by young men on the orders of their older male superiors. These men are themselves dying in large numbers, and in doing so, their mothers and sisters and daughters are mourning them. On either side of the violence of this war are women, the ones who are suffering the effects of the war in Ukraine, and the mothers of the soldiers in the Russian Federation who must wait in agony, wondering if their sons will return home or have been involved in attacks on civilians. No one knows a greater agony than the grieving mother of a fallen soldier or the grieving mother of a soldier who has returned home from a campaign that featured atrocity. Mothers are on either side of the war. They are suffering the dangers and atrocities being carried out on their children and by their children. It is therefore exceedingly inappropriate that in the public reporting of the negotiations for a ceasefire, we see few women and mothers at the table. We urge all relevant actors in the ongoing negotiations and those that follow to ensure the inclusion of women as participants and decision makers. The same should be the case for all the institutions and operations that are responding to this war. We call for humanitarian corridors to be established and protected. We urge that the humanitarian actors make certain that their operations have the ability to aid women and girls, particularly those who are survivors of rape and other forms of gender-based violence. If the war continues much longer, it will harm the food and energy security of many millions around the world. It will destroy livelihoods, increase poverty, and cause economic crisis. For a global community barely starting its recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine is a damaging blow. The result will be early deaths, political instability, and the escalation of other conflicts. The humanitarian and developmental response to that suffering must leave no country or region behind. In this regard, Kenya continues to urge the Secretary General to rally the United Nations, the major economies, and international financial institutions to design instruments that offer the most vulnerable countries, particularly in the Global South, needed support. Mr. President, I finish by once again reaffirming Kenya's lasting support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the Ambassador for Kenya's statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. May I begin, first of all, in joining others in thanking the insightful and expert and deeply thoughtful contributions of our briefers. My thanks go to Sima Bahouse from UN Women, to Mr. Manuel Fontaine from Unicef, and of course, Ms. Katerina Charapaka gave us a direct insight of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. And in doing so, it reminds me that the Geneva Conventions contain numerous provisions that afford special protections to women and girls as civilians in conflict zones. Yet, what we see today with our own eyes, and as today's detailed briefings testify, is harrowing evidence of how women and girls are suffering. Mr. Putin's invading forces are absolutely oblivious to even the most basic tenet of the Geneva Conventions, the distinction, the absolutely essential distinction between civilians and combatants. Today, sadly, we've once again heard Russia trying to deflect from the facts, the reality on the ground, muddy the waters by what can only be described as quite extraordinary statements and even lies. Yet what is true, what is fact, is that Russian attacks on civilians and residential areas have been truly barbaric. Yet what we've seen shine through this as a real beacon is the Ukrainian people themselves. Ukrainian women have demonstrated incredible fortitude and demonstrated the real resilience of the Ukrainian people. Indeed, that was reflected in the engagement our own Prime Minister had in Ukraine recently. And I myself, as we heard from the representatives of UNICEF, from UN Women, and indeed the representative of the United States, I've also had the opportunity, and I'm pleased we're joined by Poland. When I visited Poland, I saw the strength and support of the Polish people, the incredible welcome being given to fleeing refugees, but also the resilience of Ukrainian women, predominantly women, as we've heard from many statements today, who are crossing the border. They're being forced to cross the border because they want to protect their children who accompany them. We've also met and seen female members of parliament who have resorted, because they can't sit as parliamentary members, to take up firearms, to defend themselves, to defend their people. We've seen incredible courage from civic leaders refusing to leave their communities, to the countless and absolutely incredible untold stories of heroism across Ukraine, as women have stood up to Russian forces, many armed with little more than patriotism, their own sense of courage and resilience, and a fair sense of injustice. Emerging reports paint a deeply disturbing picture, including alleged rapes and sexual violence within Ukraine's borders. The violence and exploitation does not end there. Beyond the borders, displaced Ukrainian women and girls, as we've heard again today, face heightened risks of trafficking, a point made by UNICEF, and also sexual exploitation by criminal gangs. The mounting evidence of war crimes in Ukraine compels us, surely as the international community, to come together to stand and do more and stand with Ukraine, and stand with those who have faced such unspeakable violence. The vote recently to suspend the Russian Federation from the Human Rights Council was proof of our collective will to do just that. We must now work ceaselessly to investigate these crimes and to hold Mr. Putin, Russia, and the forces of Russia to account. And that is why the United Kingdom has worked closely with partners to refer this illegal invasion to the International Criminal Court, to establish a commission of inquiry through the Human Rights Council, and to establish an OSCE mission of experts. Ukraine's women, like many women around the world as they continue to do today, help build that open, democratic, free Ukraine, a society that for some reason Mr. Putin fears. And Ukrainian women's participation at all levels, as we heard today from colleagues from Ireland and Kenya, amongst others, will be central if we are to build a sustainable and lasting peace. And any peace settlement must also reflect the disproportionate impact of this conflict, this war, on the girls and women of Ukraine. In conclusion, today's UN Security Council discussion and meeting is a rallying call to us all, the international community, to recognize the impact of this illegal war, the impact of this illegal war on the very basis and foundations of international law, on the very basis and attack on the very foundations on which this institution, the United Nations, is based, the actual Charter of the United Nations itself. And it is an illegal war on the women and children of Ukraine. And ultimately, we must come together and act together to hold Russia to account for these crimes. I now resume my function as President of the Council. Before we go to the countries who are not part of this Council, I've had a request from the representative of Albania, who's asked to take the floor to make a further statement. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I listened carefully to the Russian colleague, and I'd just like to highlight 3 short aspects. First, we do not come here to make propaganda. We all know where the propaganda comes from these days, and it is not certainly from here. Second, what we say here is fact-checked and corroborated. Facts and truth are not for discussion, even when we do not like them. Third, if we are here to talk about these issues, painful ones, it is because of Russia's actions, including this aggression. Continue to claim that there is no war of aggression in Ukraine is equal to continue to claim that the world is flat. We know there are people who believe it, but that doesn't make it true. And finally, the only true threshold here is the appalling degree of unspeakable crimes we are discovering in Ukraine, unseen in Europe since decades. And I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I now move to other contributions, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Executive Director Sima Bahouz, Mr. Manuel Fontaine from Unicef, Ms. Katerina Cherepakha from Ukraine, La Strada. I also recognize a representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Although a more appropriate seat for Russia government's representatives seems to be at a trial for war crimes committed in Ukraine, since today's lies from Putin's representative predictably contain everything but the kitchen sink. As one says these days here in New York, we know Russians lie because their lips are moving. There is nothing to write home about, as the Russian comrade hasn't even shown himself out of the chamber after that embarrassment of an intervention. Lights are on, but nobody is home at the Russian mission. Mr. President, George Orwell believed that totalitarianism and the corruption of language were closely connected. Now I have to put my earphones to listen carefully to the Russian interpretation of the next couple of sentences. It is an important development that the Security Council is now addressing the issue of the Russian war against Ukraine under a new agenda item, maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. I would like to thank those Security Council members who supported its introduction. I find the interpretation I have heard quite satisfactory. What I find not satisfactory at all is how the Russian diplomat, in his statement upon the approval of the agenda item, used the Russian language to impose a different concept of reality. The agenda item, as approved, reads as follows. Once again, maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. It is neither on Ukraine, na Ukraine, as the Russian diplomat purposefully manipulated, nor any other linguistic fantasies of the Russian mission. In fact, it's not the first time the Russian mission hopes to avail of the fact that the majority of you do not speak Russian, like it was in the last session of the Security Council when Ambassador Nebenza tried and failed to quote a Russian language interview, rather. The language used for the title is exceptional for conflict-specific issues, which are mostly refer to situations in specific countries or questions concerning them. It is an acknowledgement that peace and security of Ukraine have been violated from abroad, and the Security Council will remain seized of the matter until they are restored. Along with the letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the UN addressed to the President of the Security Council concerning the threats to the territorial integrity of Ukraine due to the Russian attempted annexation of Ukraine, the new agenda item will serve as a framework for the Security Council's actions in response to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We may defeat militarily Russia in Ukraine sooner than we may deoccupy Crimea. That is why I hope, and I'm sure, that the Russian proposal to remove the letter of 2014, that is basically about Crimea, will not be supported by the necessary number of the Security Council members. Mr. President, on the 24th March, an overwhelming majority of the UN member states adopted the General Assembly resolution Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine. They particularly demanded in that resolution that civilians, including humanitarian personnel, journalists, and persons in vulnerable situations, including women and children, be fully protected. Russia voted against, thus openly showing it considers civilians, including women and children, to be a possible target. Since the beginning of its invasion, this Russian approach has proved to be true almost on a daily basis. Just last week, in the presence of the President of Ukraine, the Security Council addressed the massacre committed by the Russian troops in the city of Bucha and other towns and villages of Kyiv region during the period of occupation in March. Over the past week, a number of foreign officials, UN representatives, and foreign journalists have attended the crime scenes. Shock and outrage were the main responses of those who saw those killed and tortured, who listened to those raped and robbed. The investigation had just started, but the futility of Russia's shameless attempt to decline responsibility is clear to everyone. Unfortunately, Russia persists in adding newer and newer items to the list of its war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. On April 8, Russian missiles hit the Kramatorsk railway station, where almost 4,000 civilians, mostly elderly, women and children, were waiting for evacuation trains from the war zone. More than 50 people, including 5 children, were killed. More than 100 were wounded, many of them severely. I will not develop the false theory of Russia that Russia does not possess .U, including because Russia deployed many .U's in the territory of Belarus. It speaks volumes that Russian attempts to conceal the traces following the strike were similar to those Russia had resorted to after shooting down the MH17 flight in 2014. initial triumphant reports by Russian propaganda, this time about hitting a concentration of Ukrainian troops in the Kramatorsk railway station, were deleted immediately after the information on the real outcomes of the strike appeared. Instead, the regular fake narrative on Ukrainians killing themselves was again activated. It will neither persuade others nor help Russia to escape responsibility. The world's trust in Russia and its diplomats is as dead as a doornail. The investigation will establish all responsible and they will be brought to justice. Dear colleagues, the scope of atrocities that the Ukrainian women and children suffer now has not been seen in the region since the end of the Second World War. Like its Nazi predecessors, Russia has launched a policy of extermination of the entire people. The Russian soldiers have been allowed by their superiors to kill everyone who identifies herself or himself as Ukrainian, regardless of who they are. The very modest, preliminary, and incomplete figures recorded by the OHCHR include 245 women killed as of April 7. The sex of 831 adults killed is yet unknown. According to our governmental sources, at least 183 children have been killed and 342 wounded. This toll of casualties, outrageous by itself, does not include the victims in Mariupol. It is impossible so far to establish how many women and children have been killed and injured there. In an attempt to cover up the killings of thousands of civilians in this besieged Ukrainian city and to prevent Bucha-like publicity, Russian troops are reported to be deploying mobile crematoriums to burn dead bodies of civilians. Again, the historical associations are easily traceable. The inhuman cruelty of the Russian invaders has turned the lives of millions of Ukrainian women and children into a horrific nightmare. Fleeing from Russian liberators, more than 4.3 million refugees have left Ukraine. 6.5 million people have become internally displaced persons. The overwhelming majority of them are women and children. This is the largest displacement in Europe since the 40th of the 20th century. The safety of women refugees remains a matter of concern. We should focus on how to protect them from sexual violence and trafficking in either labor or sex schemes of exploitation, as well as on how to ensure physical and psychological recovery for victims. I would like to inform you in this regard that a special web page, safewomen.com.ua, with information on how to protect Ukrainian women and children from human trafficking, has been recently launched in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, the briefer from Ukraine has provided you with examples of appalling cases of targeted repressions against female officials and female activists in the occupied territories. The execution of Ms. Olha Sukhenko, the head of the village of Matizhin, Kyiv region, along with her husband and son, is just one of these examples. The entire scope of the humanitarian consequences of the occupation of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions has yet to be established. At the same time, the existing data already serves as a reminder of the extreme vulnerability of women and children in a situation of war. The withdrawal of Russian troops has revealed evidence of unimaginable suffering, with killings, unspeakable torture, and sexual violence, including rape and mutilation. For instance, the prosecutor's office is now investigating the case happened in Brovary district, Kyiv region, when a Russian soldier killed a local resident and then repeatedly raped his wife in their private house. The suspect's identity has been established. The Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, in cooperation with pretrial investigation agencies and healthcare facilities, is now launching a special mechanism of documentation of cases of sexual violence by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women. Prosecutors and investigators are also closely cooperating with human rights defenders and NGOs that provide the women affected with medical and psychological support. I would like to reiterate the message delivered by my President to the Security Council a week ago. We are ready for cooperation with international institutions to ensure full and transparent investigation. It is also important that the UN bodies, including UN Women and Unicef, address these issues and ensure full-fledged monitoring of the situation with women and children in the situation of the war of Russia against Ukraine. I would also like to draw the attention of the Security Council to the fact that the invaders have already taken more than 121,000 children out of Ukraine. Moreover, Russia is reported to have drafted a bill to simplify and accelerate the procedure for the adoption of abducted Ukrainian children, both orphans and those who have parents and other relatives. Most of these children were abducted from Mariupol to Donetsk and Russian city of Taganrog. These actions flagrantly violate Article 7 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Mr. President, Ukrainian women have always been an indispensable part of the solution of crisis and conflict. The unprovoked and unjustified war waged by Russia has highlighted this role in government, business, and civil society. Since 2014, Ukraine's women have been increasingly engaged in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, guided by UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and Ukraine's commitment to a gender equality policy. Ukraine was the first of the world's countries to adopt a national action plan for WPS 1325 under wartime conditions, and Ukraine has now adopted a second national action plan until 2025. Ukraine's female activists have been active in promoting initiatives aimed at supporting the Ukrainian army, strengthening public awareness and preparedness to war-related emergencies. The Ukrainian government and local communities have been working together. The Ministry of Social Policy and the Government Commissioner on Gender Equality Policy have established a network of advisors in all Ukrainian regions to ensure a gender-sensitive response to all situations, including emergencies such as these. Ukraine's women are proactive on all levels of community action: community local governance, local humanitarian responses. Many high government positions are held by women, and they are promoting full accountability for the war crimes being committed now. Ukraine's women have been actively contributing to Ukraine's security as members of the army and law enforcement, as peace builders, human rights and women's rights defenders. They seek meaningful inclusion in all the processes to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and bring peace back to Ukrainian soil. Mr. President, let me conclude with another letter that was made public in Ukraine several days ago. A 9-year-old boy is writing to his mother on the occasion of the Women's Day. I quote, "Mama, this letter is my gift to you on the Women's Day of the 8th of March. Thank you for the best 9 years of my life. Many thanks for my childhood. You are the best mama in the world. I will never forget you. I wish you good luck in the heavens. I wish you to get to paradise. I will try to behave well to get to paradise too. Kiss you, your Tola." This was a 9-year-old boy from the town of Hostomel, Kiev region, and his mother was killed by Russian soldiers when they tried to escape from the occupied town by car. The boy stayed in the vehicle until local residents were able to rescue him and take him to a shelter. Such letters should not have to be written. If they are, it means that something has gone terribly wrong, including here at the United Nations. It would mean its mechanism of maintaining international peace and security aren't working properly and should be fixed. But could they be fixed while Russia is allowed to use the rights of a permanent member? If we are not able to stop the Kremlin, more and more children will become orphans. More and more mothers will lose their children. Today in Ukraine, tomorrow somewhere else. The Kremlin must be stopped for the sake of future generations, to save them from the scourge of war in Ukraine and throughout the world, as the UN Charter envisages. And I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of Ukraine. I now invite the representative of Poland to take the floor. Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, Excellencies, I would like to thank the United Kingdom and especially Ambassador Barbara Woodward for organizing this important and timely briefing and for shedding light on the situation of women and girls in Ukraine in the aftermath of Russia's aggression. I would like to thank the excellent briefers for their insights and, most importantly, all their work in supporting Ukrainian women and girls. All conflicts and humanitarian crises disproportionately impact women and girls. Not only do they suffer from direct military consequences, but also they are victims of instability, human trafficking, and sexual violence. That's especially true right now in Ukraine, as we heard. Mr. Chair, the number of people who fled Ukraine since Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression on February 24th has risen to over 4.5 million. Nearly 2.6 million of those refugees have arrived in Poland. The overwhelming majority of those trying to leave Ukraine are women and children. According to UNHCR, as many as 90% of those fleeing Ukraine, fleeing the country, are women and children. They also constitute majority of the internally displaced persons. Women and children displaced with no contacts or help are at a higher risk of trafficking and other forms of abuse. They are physically and psychologically weakened, unfamiliar with their new surroundings, and highly vulnerable to become victims to criminals. This is true both for refugees and internally displaced persons. Reports are emerging of sexual violence by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women and girls who are fleeing the country. It is crucial to address the unique needs of women and children crossing the borders. Polish authorities have put measures in place in all border crossing areas and reception centers to control what has direct access to refugees. These measures include identifying and registering the names of those accessing reception and accommodation centers, and the names and registration plates of those with whom refugees leave sites. There are also information materials for people from Ukraine crossing the Polish-Ukrainian border. Leaflets are available in Ukrainian, Polish, and English, both in paper and electronic format. Mr. President, once in a safe haven, the importance of refugees' access to the labor market becomes a priority. Employment is not only a way to support themselves and their families, but also to regain a sense of security. Last month, Poland enacted a law allowing Ukrainian guests to legally live and work in the country for at least 18 months with full access to the state social protection system of healthcare and schooling. In addition, a Ukrainian citizen may also apply for a residence permit for another 3 years. The Polish government works together with the municipalities as they struggle to find out long-term housing, jobs, and placements in school for our Ukrainian guests. Given the fact that the refugees are predominantly women and with children, we are exploring the ways to support integration of women in the labor market. Once is the examples in the care sector. Considering that the majority of refugees are women with children because men stayed and returned to Ukraine to defend their country, a big challenge is to provide nursery and kindergarten care. There are also programs in place to assist women finding employment in sectors where men are traditionally overrepresented. Mr. President, only in the capital city of Warsaw, there are 100,000 refugee children. 15,000 of them are already enrolled in schools. In the whole country, this number approaches 200,000. Children from Ukraine have the right to attend Polish schools on the same basis as Polish nationals. We offer different opportunities for children. Some newcomers are enrolling directly to the Polish schools, especially in the smaller towns. Poland is also establishing classes with all Ukrainian children and teachers who also have just arrived. These children will follow Ukrainian curriculum and be taught in Ukrainian. Ukrainian higher education students also have the opportunity to continue their education at the Polish universities. Patients evacuated from the oncological wards are being admitted to the hospitals worldwide, thanks to the initiative of the Polish First Lady, undertook in cooperation with their counterparts and members of the royal families. And our First Lady has just visited also here the respected agencies in the United Nations system. It has also to be stressed that refugee children, just like all children around the world, were already dealing with the mental health challenges from being isolated during the almost 2 years of the pandemic. Now, having left the warm comforts of home, not to mention their fathers who stayed in Ukraine to fight, any move toward the pre-pandemic normalcy has been cruelly interrupted. We offer psychological and other mental health social services to help Ukrainian refugees. However, the needs are growing every day. And we cannot help everybody without active, concrete, coordinated, and immediate assistance from the international community, including the UN system. Mr. President, women are not only victims in this crisis, but are also carrying through their families, the communities, and the nation. We want to pay a tribute to Ukrainian women who in large numbers have joined the pro-European protest movement, and since then they have played a powerful role in Ukrainian civil society and directed relief efforts. Women-led organizations helped fund and supply the Ukrainian military, provided medical care, food and social services to the large internally displaced populations. Women volunteers are the majority of the humanitarian aid and service providers in Ukraine, often the first on the ground to provide humanitarian assistance and deliver life-saving supplies. I pay tribute to the organization like La Strada Ukraine that we just heard. Ukrainian women represented in their government are playing a key role in developing policies that will be crucial in mitigating the effects of the war in the aftermath of the conflict. So there is the war, but there is also hope and solidarity. In many cases, hope and solidarity have faces of women. Let them prevail. And I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of the statement from Poland. We're now going to hear from Romania, I believe, next. Thank you. Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. President, Romania welcomes the initiative to hold a meeting dedicated to women's participation to the peace and security of Ukraine. I would first like to thank the briefers for their insightful contributions. At the outset, let me reiterate Romania's strong condemnation of the completely unjustified and unprovoked military attack of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, as well as the reported atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces in a number of occupied Ukrainian towns, now liberated. Romania reiterates its strong support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and remains committed to assisting Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. February 24th, 2022 will remain one of the darkest days in history after the end of the Second World War. This aggression has sparked massive displacement, forcing over 11 million people to flee their homes. Every day, we are witnessing women and children, older persons, and persons with disabilities fleeing their houses, their hometowns, their country, seeking help in neighboring countries. Every day, we hear incredible and tragic life stories, women and children fleeing to save their lives, leaving behind their fathers, husbands, and sons. As we closely monitor the devastation and immense suffering, the international community must also maintain its focus on the continued reports of horrific violations and abuses of human rights. The military actions of the Russian Federation disproportionately affect the most vulnerable. Children continue to be killed, wounded, and deeply traumatized by the violence all around them, while women and girls face an even higher risk of various forms of gender-based violence. Ukrainian women and children crossing international borders are more exposed to the risk of human trafficking, including online. Mr. President, Romania has been in the front line as one of the largest receiving countries for Ukrainians fleeing the terror since the beginning of the war. Alongside its allies and partners, Romania is trying to find the best solutions to help the population in need, be it on the territory of Ukraine or as refugees on Romania's territory. We also support the Republic of Moldova, which is facing a massive influx of Ukrainian refugees. The humanitarian response set up by the government of Romania was structured in two stages. The emergency response to the humanitarian crisis, covering the urgent needs at border crossing points, humanitarian transports, and the transport of refugees to temporary accommodation places, and the structural stage of developing protection mechanisms. As we approach the second phase of the intervention, the government has set up 6 working groups that have the role to design inclusion and protection policy measures in the following areas: health, education, labor, housing, vulnerable persons, children, and youth. Each working group develops sectorial action plans in collaboration with experts from the corresponding ministries, UN agencies, and representatives of the civil society. The response to all this human suffering has been swift and all-encompassing. We have seen national NGOs, international NGOs, UN institutions, but also simple Romanians from all across the country offering help, be it in food supplies, transportation, and accommodation in their own homes. Between February 10 and April 10, more than 700,000 Ukrainian citizens entered Romania. 80,000 are currently in our country. At the same time, between February 10 and today, almost 4,400 Ukrainian citizens applied for asylum in Romania. These citizens benefit from all rights provided by the Romanian legislation. Throughout the proceedings, asylum seekers can benefit from accommodation in the centers of the General Inspectorate for Immigration, if they so wish, as well as measures of material, financial, medical assistance, specialized psychological and legal counseling, access to the labor market, and cultural adaptation activities. Complementary, the asylum seekers can also benefit from the support of international and non-governmental organizations. Ukrainian citizens receive free medical care and appropriate treatment for emergencies through the National Emergency Medical Care System. Regarding children, I would like to underline that all Ukrainian children on the territory of Romania, including those who do not apply for a form of protection as provided by the law on asylum, have the right to receive education in Romanian schools in the same conditions as Romanian people. They have the right to receive free accommodation in boarding schools, food allowance, school supplies, footwear, clothing, and textbooks. Their health is examined in medical school offices, and if they have not received a vaccine, they can access the national vaccination scheme from the national program of the Ministry of Health. I would also like to mention that with the support of UNICEF and in partnership with the relevant Romanian institutions as well as with local NGOs, Blue Dot centers have been set in place in several border crossing points to provide psychological and legal support and counsel to families and to unaccompanied minors arriving in Romania. Separated families are also helped to reunite. Mr. President, conflicts disproportionately harm women and girls. We are seeking this every day in the eyes of women and children that cross our border, fleeing Ukraine because of the Russian military aggression. We do our best to help them overcome these difficult times and to preserve their dignity. We stand up for our values. We stand united for those who are suffering. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for Romania's statement. We will now hear from the representative of Germany. Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank you for organizing this briefing and Executive Director Sima Bahous of UN Women, as well as Mr. Fontaine from UNICEF and Ms. Cheripacha from La Stada International Ukraine for their important contributions to this meeting. The consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine on the situation of women and children are nothing but shocking. The horrible pictures from Bucha and Irpin of bodies of civilians lying dead on the streets are engraved in our memory. Among them were the bodies of women and girls who have become victims of sexual violence and rape by Russian soldiers and mercenaries. Some reports suggest that bodies of killed women and girls were burned or run over by the perpetrators trying to cover their deeds. These crimes and other crimes in dozens of Ukrainian cities will not be left unanswered against women and girls, but also against civilians. Germany fully supports the important work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the UN Human Rights Council has set in place a commission of inquiry that will investigate into these cases and others. We fully support the opening of an independent investigation by ICC prosecutor Karim Khan, and will provide further assistance if needed. Germany will actively contribute to ensuring that perpetrators are brought to justice, and it is important that all accountability mechanisms take into account the gender dimension of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Like in other conflicts, this war is impacting women and men differently, and it is often those that are already marginalized and face intersecting forms of discrimination who suffer most. We therefore have to ensure that women participate fully, equally, and meaningfully in decisions regarding humanitarian assistance, the refugee situation, as well as peace-building, reconstruction, recovery, and possible post-conflict scenarios, and that all measures are gender-responsive. Russia's aggression has caused one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War in Europe, and as the vast majority of those fleeing Ukraine are women and children, they are at risk of falling victim to criminal activity, as has been said by many briefers. It is crucial to protect women and children to the best extent possible, and in this regard we commend in particular the work of UNHCR and UNICEF. The disruption of education is a deeply aggravating factor, endangering the well-being of children who often arrive exhausted, traumatized, and malnourished in countries of destination. More than half of Ukraine's children have been displaced due to the war, and additionally more than 750 schools in Ukraine have been damaged since the beginning of the conflict, denying thousands of children access to education. We commend UNICEF's efforts to provide children of families fleeing the violence with education kits and to help repair damaged schools and kindergartens. And we also support the important work of UN Women Peace and Humanitarian Fund in Ukraine and in Moldova that has been explained by Sima Bahous. To conclude, Germany reiterates its full solidarity with Ukraine, including its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, and we renew our urgent call on President Putin to stop this war immediately, to end the indescribable human suffering, and to withdraw the Russian troops from Ukrainian territory fully and unconditionally. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. And with that, there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers, and this meeting is now adjourned.